on the note of executing people's grandparents just because they're
Yes.
old.
We need to talk about executing people's grandparents.
All right.
All
All
right,
right.
so
We're live.
dogmatic in support of shooting grandparents.
Yes.
Um,
Death camps for grandma and grandpa. No, not really. But hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Authoritarian to Different Ends. And today we got a bit of a smaller crew today to try to manage the conversation a little bit. Also because it's a very specialized conversation at the same time. But we're here to talk about Malthus, overpopulation, why Thanos is actually right, but that might come up. I don't know if it will. Also, why Malthus was at least partially right and that we should have executed the boomers. But yeah, anyway, I think we have some familiar faces. We got Ray back. We have Nero back as well. And we also have someone who showed up for a little bit on the last one, but he was very patient and didn't talk too much. But we have Denying History. So how you doing, man?
I don't have much to say.
The silent but deadly type, clearly. So, um, uh, let's see. I know we were joking about, of course, executing grandparents, or were we? But we did want to start off this conversation. I think we wanted to start it off specifically with the question of stemming the tides of African immigration to Europe and such, and the problems that create, and how Malthus might have been correct, and that we should, and certain things we should be implementing to, stem his predictions of world-ending overpopulation and things like that. I do have to say, though, one brief thought on overpopulation as a whole. I'm not necessarily a believer in this notion that at any one point in time there's a population at which the Earth, can't sustain itself. I think like, if at some point in the future we have, 24, 25 billion people on the planet, which is more than 3 times the amount we have now, I think we collectively as a species would be able to handle it. I think we could find a way to allow the Earth to sustain us all, because with the technology we have now, we're almost capable of turning any land on Earth into arable farmland. And we're constantly, at least here in the States, we're constantly able to constantly grow more food than we're able to consume. It's really just a matter of resource allocation in large part. I do think, I think we could solve world hunger if we really wanted to, yada, yada, yada. But I do think that perhaps, even if there's no one set limit of population that the Earth won't be able to handle, I do think we've accelerated the rate of population growth to make it so that we as a species aren't able to cope with it. Like the Earth might be able to handle it, ecologically speaking, but we as a species are kind of shitting it, shitting the bed here in terms of how we're handling it. So is that
Yeah,
go
but
on, Nero?
about resource allocation, what Malthus predicted was that population size will grow faster than the supplies of anything essential to life. So if the supply of resources is unable to serve the needs of a population that is beyond a population size that is beyond that of its maximum carrying capacity, then what do you do? How are you supposed to allocate resources among a population that has effectively wasted those resources and has reproduced more than the supplies of resources that have been produced or grown?
Well, I don't necessarily agree with the contention that throughout history it's been the fact that people grow at rates at which their technology is unable to keep up with them and the resources they are able to produce aren't able to keep up with them. I think there are certain times where such things have happened, and I think we're in the middle of one of those such times now. But I don't think that's necessarily a historical trend. I think we've historically been able to about keep pace with it because, we used to have a much higher infant mortality rate. We used to have a much higher mortality rates in general because of diseases and our inability to cure them and such. And so I think the human population and its sort of the balancing act it did with nature was able to sustain itself for a long time. And it's only because we've now developed such massive technological advances all at once that allow us to live far longer. Mortality rate, infant or otherwise, has just plummeted so rapidly that now is specifically a time in which resource allocation has become a problem. But throughout history, I wouldn't say it has been a problem. Like I said, nature's been always able to keep us in check previously. It's just now that we're sort of getting out of hand.
Ray, do you have any comments about the whole Malthus predicted that resource allocation would practically become impossible if population size expands beyond the carrying capacity?
Yeah, it's going to happen. Or I mean, I should say it could happen, just not in the way that people think that it would. Like the standard narrative is, oh, you end up having too many people and too few resources. You have to also take into account allocation, which is what pragmatic is saying. But at the same time, there's still a finite carrying capacity the Earth has. So let's say, for example, hypothetically speaking, you were to come out and say that you could redistribute resources in such a way that you could feed every person on Earth. Okay, what level are we talking about here? So let's say we have 9 billion people, what am I saying, right? Let's say you upped that and you had, say, 15 billion people or, say, 27 billion people. Like, at what point here do you actually run out of the ability to generate food sustainably? Because it's possible, of course, to feed that many people, maybe, right? If you just like really went for intensive farming all over the place. However, the consequences of doing that, negative externalities such as the amount of global warming you'd be creating, dead zones in the ocean from agricultural runoff and things like this, you'd be paying for it in ways that would still result in a mass death scenario.
I don't see, that's where I'm going to disagree somewhat, because I do think there are sustainable farming methods that not only have we picked up throughout history, but that we have more available to us now thanks to the technology. I'm not just talking about, green farming or things like that, or green energy and such, but the idea that, if we could, shift society in some way, shape, or form. Like, I don't think the way we're organized now in terms of the industrial complex and how massive it is and how massive the pollution is, not specifically from the first world, but just in general. Like, I don't believe that's ecologically sustainable right now. But I think if there were some, say, massive societal shift, one which, Zizek keeps talking about and he keeps claiming is necessary in order to save the planet, although he never talks about how we're going to get there. But if there were such a shift, and it were a shift towards becoming a, once again, wholly agrarian society, I think there'd be enough ways for us to sustain it without having these, massive dead zones in the ocean because of agricultural runoff. Like, I don't think it's necessary to have all those chemicals that would cause such things, or I don't think there would even be this sort of global warming, because I think there's our sustainable.
No, hold on.
Hold on.
No, wait. Hold on. No, the way that he just said that would happen. No, hold on. Let me get that. The way that he just said that would happen would be through returning to an agrarian mode of production.
I don't think Zizek has said that. I'm saying I think.
Yeah. You're saying that you would that would be the way to do it. But then, what would be the point?
What would be the point? I think it's
as in who would want to live that way again?
Well, it's not a matter of sort of who would want to live that way. It's a matter of, can we survive the way we're going right now? And is it better for all of us if we go back to this way? And I think it is just better if we, all to go back to being quote unquote muck farmers. I not only think it's more ecologically sustainable, I think it's just this is a case besides what we're talking about here in terms of population control.
I think it does tie in, because if that's really the choice, then surely people should just choose to actually comply with the reduction in population which needs to take place then. Like, if people had to choose between either do what you just said or reduce the population and keep what we have now, why would anyone choose to do what you just described?
Oh, because I don't think simple answer, people are stupid. Long, complicated answer, I think people are easily wooed by high material standards of living, and they don't want to give it up. I don't blame people for not wanting to be muck farmers. I don't. Yeah,
because I think if you think about it, most of the third world just got out of being muck farmers. Why would you ask them to go back? This is the same, the same kind of thing that I think, like, what bipartisan complaints on this issue have been going on for quite a while, where you've got people essentially holding up a magnifying glass over areas of the third world that have just started to not necessarily be as poor as they were before, and then blaming them for everything and saying, no, you need to go back to the idyllic, which was not idyllic life that you had before. No one wants to do that.
Well, yeah, I think there was also there's cultural context to take into account here, of course, but at the same time, I think one of the things I think people point to when they look at the third world and start blaming them for stuff is obviously pollution, because they are a newly industrialized portion of the world, and so obviously they're going to be polluting at much higher rates than, say, a country like the United States or Germany or something, because we've had the time to learn how to reduce the waste of our manufacturing processes. And
to develop up to the point where reduction of that kind of waste is economical.
To be fair,
everyone will get there eventually, just so long as you accelerate to move them through the developmental stages as fast as humanly possible.
Yeah, but I'll be fair to Malthus. I'm sorry. The thing about Malthus is that his theories were developed in the late 1700s, early 1800s, before the Industrial Revolution. And also, as my friend Alexander the Great mentioned in 2017 in Academics, ANCAP versus status debate, and Voltaire participated in that debate, by the way. He's in the stream chat. Alexander, I think, mentioned before the stream or in the stream that the prediction that CO2 or certain chemicals would contribute to growing global temperatures stretches back all the way to like the 1840s. So it's been around a long time, but Malthus wasn't alive, of course, to see things like what all the signs involving climate change. She probably didn't have anything about climate in mind. But I thought someone was going to speak next. But there is one thing. I mean, even if you were to transition from CO2 to green energy, like in my personal opinion, nuclear energy is the best. Solar energy is also pretty good, but it's very labor intensive. Solar energy, so it's not much to replace all CO2 products with solar energy. I don't think that's ever going to happen in our lifetime. I'm just saying.
Yeah,
the midway point for the transition from traditional forms of energy to the kind of energy we're aiming for, you're going to have to go through natural gas on your way there, which is reduced CO2 and not zero CO2, but you're going to have to.
Yeah, no, natural gas is a relatively cleaner alternative, so to speak.
Yeah, but the thing is though, is that even then, even if we were to replace oil with more green energies, you're still going to have the problem of resource allocation. And I'll bring up one thing that contributes to climate change that doesn't get a lot of attention from the left. And that is, of course, and this is going to trigger the meat eaters. I triggered Academics fan base once by arguing for a meat tax. And here's why I argued for a meat tax. And this is going to be a paragraph. I'm sorry, I took a lot of notes on this. As Skeptical Science notes, methane is a more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. Well, CO2 is still the major issue because there's more of it in the atmosphere. At the time the article was published, it was 380 parts per million in CO2 compared to 1.75 parts per million in methane. There is no doubt that the consumption of meat products has contributed to disastrous methane emissions. How? Because population growth has fueled the efficiency of industrial agriculture. And since we are natural omnivores, we eat a fuck ton of meat. So the supply of meat, which fuels methane, is being done at a rate that is ecologically destructive, so decreasing its consumption is a good idea, because the higher the birth rates, the higher the supply of meat. And the lower the birth rates, logically speaking, the lower the supply of meat. So I think this would be a pretty good argument for population control measures, because by lowering the birth rates, you reduce a greenhouse gas that is more potent than CO2, and therefore would also be effective in fighting climate change. And
Yeah, well,
Sure, but I mean, I wouldn't
agree
call
with
it.
you overtly, because I'll just say this real quick, right? Because one of the things I've sort of been quote unquote red pilled on is not big pharma, but big farm, where essentially there's huge sections of the U.S. agricultural industry that have been subsidized to produce massive amounts of corn, and as such, because there's so much corn being produced, some of that is used to overproduce meat. And because corn has no nutritional value, they're pumping up their cows with steroids and stuff like that, and all these other drugs, and it's shitty for human beings. But even besides that, to the points you were making, it's causing there to be more methane in the atmosphere, which is again also ecologically destructive. So I think if you were to return to a more naturalist agrarian type society, you wouldn't see this massive influx of meat like you have now. I think this is another sort of phenomenon of not necessarily government being involved, but
But here's why that'll never happen. The reason why, as birth rates grow, the supply of meat grows, is because, again, we are omnivores. We love to eat fucking meat. And if going back to an agrarian society involves lowering the supplies of meat, no one is going to want to fucking do that. Unless you were to have some form of collectivization, like in the Ukraine, where you basically force people to, no, not like the Ukraine, but you get my idea, basically, that you'll be forcing people to work on smaller, more agrarian farms. It's not going to happen anytime soon because of what the market demands. It's all in the supply and demand. But you lower the demand of meat by lowering the size of a population that demands it excessively. So I think the Malthusian solution to methane is the most logical and practical one.
Well, I think to some extent, the rate at which we produce meat now is, again, partially because we've subsidized the food source for meat. And so because we have so much corn and we need to use it on something, it's being sold as feed to these other farms who use it then on their cows. So I do think we can lower the meat from the supply.
Yes, I was hoping we would get to that.
Now.
Yeah, I was hoping we would get to that. All the agricultural subsidies in the United States need to be abolished.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that. And I think it's just because I think it's at least one of the reasons is because we're overproducing. We are overproducing food. Like, it's not simply that the United States is producing more food than it itself can eat, but almost more food than or at least more corn than the world can consume multiple times over. But because it's being produced, farmers need to find a use for it. Otherwise, they're just having a massive supply, and that's going to bring the price down, but they can't have that. So they're selling it off and doing God knows what with it, like feeding it to the cows. And so a lot of agricultural products are being overproduced.
All I'm really saying, though, is that it's being overproduced because there's a heavy demand for it. There's a lot of money to be made by supplying all this red meat, by supplying cow meat for those cheeseburgers we all love at McDonald's or Wendy's or shit like that. Because there's a lot of cash to be made from that in the private sector. The private sector is reluctant to go after CO2 emissions. I mean, this is just common sense.
No, it's true. I mean, it's one of the reasons I'm no longer as capitalist.
Free market.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I'm not really as free market as I used to be. It's because I understand sort of this sort of thing. There is a demand for it, and people will demand it. But just because people demand it doesn't make it good. Just because people voluntarily do it doesn't make it good. I'm not, fuck the nap and all that kind of. But honestly, I think it's, again, like what Ray said, abolish agricultural subsidies. I think we can lower the demand for meat if we start to do, as like you said, regulate it a little bit more. And I don't think, now getting back to Malthus a little more specifically, what were his predictions? Because I know a lot of people like to bag on Malthus, not specifically because, what he said was not because of his theories, so forth, but more because he got predictions wrong. Like, a lot of people like to do this. A lot of people like to point at someone and say, oh, your predictions are wrong, but they don't really go at what the people's saying, because I essentially believe that a lot of people had underlying principles correct, but just applied them incorrectly when making their theory. So what were some of like these theories that Malthus made that ended up kind of getting shit on? And was it because of his underlying principles being mistaken, or was it more because he just misapplied his own sort of underlying research.
Well,
One
yeah,
of the
what
biggest
what he
mistakes.
believed. Oh, I'm sorry. The
Which
thing
one of
is,
us should go first? I'll let you go first.
okay, sorry. All I was going to really say is that, well, two things really. I think a lot of people don't like Malthus. Malthus, I'm sorry. Is because some of his solutions seem very misanthropic. But that's mostly pathos bullshit, so I don't really give a shit about that. But here's the thing. Here's the thing. The second reason why people shit on Malthus is because his predictions. Malthus basically thought that the results of overpopulation were just around the corner, like they were just going to happen. But the thing is, thanks to the Industrial Revolution, the extent that overpopulation would hurt us has been prolonged. So, for example, as I got into methane earlier, as birth rates rise, the supply of meat rises. However, it's safe to say, as Ray would argue, that as time goes on, as these destructive agricultural practices expand and expand to accommodate growing populations, the growing sizes of populations, eventually the supply of meat will go down because there isn't enough animals to raise to kill them and eat them, right? So over time, the supply of meat will go down, and then there won't be enough meat for humans to consume. So, but that, in my opinion, will not occur until like what 2100 or way beyond that. The thing is, Malthus was correct, but to the time period he believed it would occur was way off. His predictions would not come true until at least another 200, 300 years. Ray, would you like to add on?
Yeah. There are also examples of him. Like I think his biggest wrong prediction was the Ireland thing, where for some reason he believed that the reason that the Irish disaster famine scenario was going to happen would be because there were too many Irish people in Ireland, right? Mm-hmm. More people in Ireland than could be sustained by agriculture. This was untrue. The reason why Ireland imploded the way that it did in the 1800s was because of a long story involving the rise of liberal capitalism, monocropping, in which people ended up monocropping potatoes, and because of the fact that fields were appropriated for the running of cattle across them because certain rich people, the emergent bourgeoisie, decided they wanted to eat red meat. This then displaced grain to a large extent, and then the monocropping of potatoes was inserted in place of what they had already displaced. This monocropping then ran into a real problem once they imported from another location potatoes which had the potato blight, which then destroyed the entire potato crop. And then the people were unable to eat, not because there were too many people, but rather because there were suddenly too few potatoes, and that was the thing that people were monocropping. It was then exacerbated by the fact that the poor laws were passed, which meant that people had to actually go through means testing in order to qualify for assistance. And the means testing was set at such a level that in order to qualify for the means testing, you had to sell off your land in order to get it to happen. So you ended up with everyone being totally cleaned out, right? Which is obviously, typically what people like Lord Russell and so on were getting up to. The whole place was totally cleaned out. You ended up with people being passed through the poorhouse and exiting the scenario poorer than when they went in. And additionally, you had a mass emigration of Irish people out of Ireland into the United States. So that was an all-around disaster, but that was actually created by the Liberal Party of Great Britain, not by overpopulation.
Well, you do need to remember that, the socializing of agriculture and the poor laws came after 3 consecutive potato blights, right? It's not so much that it was caused by these policies so much.
Oh, yeah. I'm talking about those things came after, of course. But I'm saying that they obviously exacerbated the problem. But people who looked back, who were Malthusian and looked at that, were like, oh, well, the reason that Irish people had to leave Ireland is because of the fact that there were too many of them, which is actually not true. The reason Irish people, quote, had to leave Ireland is because of the fact that there was a famine. But the famine was not generated by overpopulation.
Mm-hmm. Also, the whole Malthus, I don't know why. I struggle sometimes with saying his name. But anyway, the thing is that his solutions, as I said, many interpret it as misanthropic, and here's why. But I will also clarify something along with that. What Malthus argued was to resolve overpopulation, you need two things: positive checks and preventative checks. Positive checks are that which artificially lowers the population. That has nothing to do with birth. Usually just call it the death rate, of course. But in the modern context, as a neo-Malthusian, I would argue, like, for example, if you were to deport the 20 million illegal immigrants in the US, that would be an example of a positive check. But the thing is like, in his time, a positive check would have been the poorhouses, where basically you expand the death rate by having people work in poorhouses. Denine will get into that. He knows more about that than I do. But he argued for expanding the death rate, and that goes a little bit into... People misinterpret that because here's the thing. In later renditions of his essay on population growth, he clarified that if you use misery as a way to lower the population size, it could potentially lead to long-term instability, so it's counterproductive. So he did clarify that, but people like to misinterpret his more his positive checks as something like Thanos, where you just basically kill off people deliberately to lower the population size. By the way, Thanos did nothing wrong.
I think all of these approaches are.
I was going to get into preventative checks. Preventative checks is what most neo-Malthusians focus on, and that is to say, legalizing abortions, contraception, condoms, birth control, and also sex education. It's been demonstrated that comprehensive sex education has decreased teenage pregnancies and also lowers other risks. Europe has had comprehensive sex education, and unlike in the U.S., where this was like a long time ago. But I remember back in middle school, we had sex education and basically said that condoms lead to AIDS and nothing more. Don't ever use them. Like, that is complete bullshit. If you want to lower birth rates, you need comprehensive sex education, condoms, abortions, and shit like that.
Well, okay, so I'm going to disagree slightly here, only from a sort of a Catholic moral standpoint, because I think what's happened first off, the difference between the United States and Europe is one of, and the differences in birth rates, I think, are one of a demographic question, not so much who's got the better sex ed, because I think one of the things you can kind of look at with this mass migration into Europe and comparing it to the demographics over here, unlike whites who tend to, once they reach a certain material standard of living in which they're able to sustain themselves, they stop having more kids because they realize they don't need to have more kids to pass on their genes, right? They have a high enough material standard of living where they can just have the 2 or 3 kids and just meet the replacement rate. And at that point, they're all right because the material standard of living in which they are currently living is enough to just sustain that. But other races don't really quite they don't really quite get that. So they continue to have more and more children. I think one of the things that Pew pointed out in some of their recent polling was that Muslim immigrants or immigrants from MENA areas continue to have high amounts of kids or a number of kids well over the replacement rates, even when they're in these very progressive, very wealthy European nations. And so,
yeah, we're going to get into that, but I would.
And
like
so,
to
I don't think it's necessarily a matter of specifically sex ed. Like I don't think there's any one.
That as an example of how you could lower birth rates. I was just saying that as an example, and I would like to clarify before Ray responds because I know she has something to say. I can easily predict when she has something to say. It is debatable. It is always it's heavily debated among Malthusians or neo-Malthusians what preventative checks or positive checks are the best. Like, for example, there are some neo-Malthusians who are very progressive. So my idea of deporting the 15 to 20 million illegal immigrants who inhabit the United States, they would disagree with that positive check. However, we discussed this before the stream. One preventative check you could use that could actually serve as an argument for the war on drugs, which I'm pretty sure most of your audience disagrees with, but yeah, you're a fan of Durete, so the thing is, you can argue that mass incarceration is a preventative check because in prison you have no communication with the opposite sex, so the people in prison do not reproduce. So by decriminalizing drugs, since most heavy drug users are lower class, and the lower classes, globally speaking, have high birth rates, by incriminating people for drug uses, you will effectively lower birth rates, because the drug users who already have high birth rates in the US, they're unable to reproduce for the amount of time they serve in prison. Now, I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing, but that is an argument to be made. And you even agreed with that.
Well, that is the worst possible way to go about lowering birth rates, though.
Why is that? We were talking about
because
this
it's massively inefficient to have to give birth to people and then proceed to find increasing numbers of complicated ways to entrap them into economic destitution, rather than just not having those persons exist in the first place.
You could just
I don't think it's a matter of, people get born. I don't think it's a matter of, stopping people from giving birth. I'm talking about, because this is matters that are more, not so much, it's not a matter of trying to decrease the birth rate, this very second by stopping people from being born. Let's just stop people from having more kids, because by not having them in the position to have kids, because that's, in my mind, more moral than perhaps,
the best way to accomplish that without having to engage in coercive use of force against people in excess is to basically just have Planned Parenthood deal with the issue so that people can make informed choices about what they want to do, rather than regressing back to this. Well, hold on. Rather than regressing back to this 15th century style approach of just going around, I don't know, attacking the vagabonds, because that's what they used to do. I'll give you an example.
Wait.
I kind of don't mind that sort of standard, though, because I think there's a lot of positive correlates you have with sort of attacking the vagabonds.
Wait, pragmatic. Also,
I wanted to add something to Ray's point. Both of you need to.
Wait.
We'll let Nero finish, and then Ray, you go on.
Yeah, I was going to bring up also not just Planned Parenthood, but there's also this thing that I'm not sure if you saw my tweet about it, but there's this thing called Project Prevention. There's this woman who literally pays drug users to get sterilized permanently. So like she would pay, like if she would basically go out and about, especially in the impoverished areas of the country, and what her business would do is, if someone has a huge drug problem that's demonstrable, then what she would do is be like, okay, if you go to a doctor, and if you're a female, you get an IUD installed, or if you're a male, you basically
get a vasectomy.
I forgot the term.
Vasectomy?
Yeah, if you get that, then she would pay you like $500, $600 to get sterilized by a doctor. But that's after you've proven you got the sterilization. So you can also create financial incentives. I mean, listen, these are poor people. Poor people are desperate for money. So by creating financial incentives for them not to have children, you also lower the birth rate. And that goes into a little bit into positive eugenics. But yes, Project Prevention, Planned Parenthood, creating incentives for people with high demographics with high birth rates to not have children is also a good idea. But I still want to, after Ray's done, I still want to hear how your idea of mass incarceration of stoners would help lower birth rates.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I'm just gonna take you guys backwards in history for a second here, and I'll leave it up to the chat to guess where I'm reading from as well, because I'm not going to give all my sources until the end, right? And so I'm just going to make a comparison between this idea of I guess you call it negative eugenics, if that's what you want to call it, versus this stuff that had happened before. Now, bear in mind, before I begin, I'm going to preface this with the fact that I actually do agree with the idea that it would be nice to have less people in general, because of the fact that, there's a sustainability level here. However, it's just that my position that I take on this is that it should be done via the soft method of allowing women to choose how many children they want to have, rather than going in and doing violence to their children after they have actually been born. So, at any rate, I'm going to read out the violence which has occurred in the past, and then you guys tell me if you remember this stuff. So, quote, at the end of the 15th and during the whole of the 16th century throughout Western Europe, a bloody legislation against vagabondage was implemented. The fathers of the present working class were chastised for their enforced transformation into vagabonds and paupers. Legislation treated them as voluntary criminals and assumed that it depended on their own goodwill to go on working under the old conditions that no longer existed. In England, this legislation began under Henry VII, which is skipped, so they start at Henry VIII instead. Henry VIII, 1530. Beggars old and unable to work receive a beggar's license. On the other hand, whipping and imprisonment for sturdy vagabonds. They are to be tied to the cart tail and whipped until the blood streams from their bodies, and then to swear an oath to go back to their birthplace or to where they have lived the last 3 years and, quote, put themselves to labor. What a grim irony. In 27 Henry VIII, the former statute is repeated but strengthened with new clauses. For the second arrest for vagabondage, the whipping is to be repeated and half the ear is sliced off. For the third relapse, the offender is to be executed as a hardened criminal and an enemy of the Commonwealth. Now, this is obviously feudalism, right? But it gets worse. Henry VI, a statute of the first year of his reign, 1547, ordains that if anyone refuses to work, he shall be condemned as a slave to the person who has denounced him as an idler. So this was so dumb that you could literally just go around and accuse someone of slacking off, and suddenly that person has now become your slave. But continuing, the master shall feed his slave on bread and water, both weak broth and such refuse meat as he thinks fit. He has the right to force him to do any work, no matter how disgusting, with whip and chains. If the slave is absent for a fortnight, he is condemned to slavery for life and is to be branded on the forehead or back with the letter S. If he runs away 3 times, he is to be executed as a felon, apparently. The master can sell him, bequeath him, let him out on hire as a slave, just as any other personal chattel or cattle. If the slaves attempt anything against these apparent masters, they are also to be executed, it says. Justices of the peace on information are to hunt the rascals down. So they had cops whose sole purpose was to go around policing the vagabonded slaves, which capitalism had itself created. But anyway, it happens that a vagabond had been idling for about 3 days. He is to be taken to his birthplace, branded with a red-hot iron with the letter V on the breast, and be set to work in chains in the streets or at some other labor, apparently. If the vagabond I'm going to get there. If the vagabond gives a false birthplace, he is then to become the slave for life of this place, of its inhabitants or its corporation, and to be branded with an S. Isn't this insane? But we continue. All persons have...
You've gone on for it's almost like 2 or 3 minutes uninterrupted here.
Where am I going with this, right? Because obviously this is a whole list of things. It goes on until I'll tell you when this date ends, because I'll just skip to the end. The last time that these things were done to workers was in the year 1791, which was during the French Revolution, when the French bourgeoisie decided that it was actually somehow criminal for you to have a labor union, because something liberty and declaration of the rights of man, which is quite an ironic thing that they actually managed to do there, because they proclaimed liberty and immediately subtracted that liberty from the workers, because they claimed that if workers organized, that is somehow coercion. But at any rate,
hold on, Nero. Let her.
But at any rate, the point I'm getting to on this is that all of this stuff about going after people after they have been born is the kind of stuff that reminds people of this semi-feudalist and feudalist stuff that we're supposed to not be doing. And it's the kind of stuff that already is being done, by the way, because of the fact that the mass incarceration, profit-based private prison incarceration in the United States, for example, is that thing. Means-tested benefits, which should not exist because there should be no means testing. It should actually be unconditional basic income. We'll get to that eventually. That is actually a descendant of those same things as well, because that's where means testing actually comes from. And additionally, on top of that, it's already being done in the form of well, I mean, you can just choose random Republican Party policies in the United States, for example, the things where they're just yanking away people's support systems on a consistent basis. These things don't work efficiently because they're still alive while you're persecuting them, meaning that you're actually still you're still devoting resources to them, and you're also creating massive amounts of misery and economic inefficiency. Why would anyone want to go about doing things this way? I'm not even making a purely moral argument here, obviously. I'm making a utilitarian argument, which is that basically this is an enormous waste of time. Like, for example, having cops that run around trying to find people who are slacking off so as to entrap them. All this kind of stuff. That is actual economic resources being spent on this nonsense. Why not just put a condom on people and get it over with at the beginning, rather than going through all of these acrobatics because Catholics don't want people to use birth control?
Okay,
in all
so
fairness, wait. In all
yeah,
fairness,
Nero, you go and then I'll respond.
okay. Actually, all I was going to really say is that I agree. I agree with a lot of what Ray just said. But here's the thing. And I'm going to be just in all fairness. Plus, it would be fun to play devil's advocate here. I'm going to argue in favor of what you're arguing for, just for the sake of debate. But I will clarify that I don't think just maximizing incarcerations is a good idea. Also, I do favor, like, while I am very pro police, I oppose the death penalty. That's something we can discuss another day. And I also support criminal justice reform that focuses on rehabilitation. But you know what? That's a debate for another day. But for all fairness, since I think pragmatic is outnumbered here, I'm going to argue in favor of what you're arguing for, pragmatic. So, what were you going to say, pragmatic?
Okay, so first and foremost, I don't think it's a waste of resources necessarily, because one of the positive correlates that goes on with not simply, I don't agree with that sort of a vast set of laws that Ray kind of let out, where it's very obviously, selling someone into slavery because, they're idle, this and that. But like, there is something to be said of just, even when I was a more libertarian free marketish, one of the things, there's a great Murray Rothbard quote, the father of ANCAPism, so to speak, talking about using the police to simply sweep the homeless off the streets. And the reason that is because you could say that it's a waste of resource to attack them after they're born, but they're at the same time wasting resources by being alive and taking up the commons, so to speak. Making sure that we're trying to clean up the city around them as they just sort of take up space.
But this is then two layers of problem then, because of course then you have the problem of the one you just described, which is people taking up the commons who, I guess, quote, shouldn't be there, right? And then you have the punitive measures taken against them, in which the economy is essentially wasting money, now having to quote, clean them up, quote unquote, whatever that happens to mean, right? One of the ways to have avoided that problem in the first place was to not do Catholic birth fetishism. I mean, I hate to describe it that way, but I mean,
describing things.
I
love it.
I had to search for a way to describe that because I just couldn't describe it in the moment. But you know what I mean? Like,
I do.
You can solve that whole problem in the first place by just not doing the Catholic thing.
Well, I think there's plenty. Well, first off, to deal with the birth control condoms, the pill, what have you, you can just not have kids and not do those things by simply abstaining. I don't know why this is an impossible thing to ask, but the second thing,
it's because poor people, and I'm just not going to be politically correct about this. The fact is that I believe, as a sort of euphoria to escape from the shitty aspects of poverty. Let's just say this: poor people have sex like rabbits do. They have a lot of sex, and that is because it's sort of an escapism from all the suffering that comes with poverty. So what you're asking for is people to stop doing the very thing that allows them to escape from their suffering, which is not a good idea, actually. Because when you try to make the poor more miserable, they revolt. I don't think you want a Maoist revolution, my friend.
Well, I mean, here's the thing about poor people revolting. I think, then they're just giving you an excuse to actually, put down the revolution by whatever means necessary. I think that's something, that sounds, rather drastic, but it's not hard to do. Like, a lot of people, I
mean, fair enough, but the fact is, though, is that you have to take into account the fact that poor people breed like bunnies. They do it everywhere in the world, all across the globe. The impoverished breed or reproduce like rabbits, and there's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. It's A, lack of education, and B, again, it's an escapism. It's a form of pleasure that allows them to escape from the realities of the world in which they live in.
Well, hold on. I think denying history, you don't have to quietly comment from the chat. You can jump in here, but I think he had a good point. You can beat the revolution out of them when it's early enough on, and I think that's absolutely true. I don't think it's not simply the fact that it's Marx and he's implanted the idea of revolution in people now, and it's too late. Yeah, anytime you got poor people, you have to cater to them, otherwise they'll turn into Marxists. I don't believe that's true. I think you can have sort of I've always said my sort of ideal state is a sort of, in terms of legal statutes, a sort of watered down Singapore, except the more I think about it, not so watered down. Or even, as you mentioned,
what you're arguing for is basically what Duretti. I'm sorry if I'm butchering his name, by the way.
It's close enough. It's a Filipino name, so who cares?
I'm more
Rodrigo
familiar.
Duterte.
Ray, I'm not done. Okay, wait, what?
Duterte.
Yeah,
Duterte. Yeah, I apologize. I'm actually more familiar with the Indonesian language than Filipino. But yeah, Selamat pagi, by the way. What you're basically arguing for is mass incarceration of people who have high birth rates would solve the problem, because, as you said, you are a fan of this Philip, who's essentially someone who proudly says that what he's doing to drug users and sellers is comparable to the Holocaust. He proudly says that if that's the comparison to be made, he has no shame in admitting that. So, I mean, but how exactly, so what you're essentially saying is, by incarcerating stoners, and if they are repeating offenders, you execute them, or you just kill them on the spot, like the Filipinos are doing now, you would lower the birth rate? Can you explain?
Well, I think part of it is one that, less people to have kids, less people being born is, well, the very obvious part of the solution. But I think it's sort of like what England did very on, not necessarily, the laws Ray described, well, to some extent, those laws, but it was something that, the alt-type pointed out in one of his very early videos, although now he seems to be doing some kind of pivot, but I'm not paying too much attention to it, where he talks about the fact that one of the reasons England's IQ was consistently going up is because the rich were having kids and the poor kids never got a chance to reproduce because they were low IQ and they were committing crimes. And so they were just either in jail for too long to be able to have kids, or they were just flat out killed. And that's another thing. If you have a population with a higher intelligence, they're more aware of, some of the problems you're facing in a society in which you have these not only ecological problems, but of these problems of, handling the population. And so a smarter, somewhat smaller population is going to be more resource efficient than a population in which there's just, unchecked paupers.
Yeah, what you're saying isn't necessarily incorrect. I mean, there was a study that was done, and I tried to link the article to it, but as Denine pointed out earlier, but which I misinterpreted as you spreading the link to this hangout around, but I won't quibble. He brought up the fact that you cannot share links in the chat.
Yeah, I don't know what's up with that. I'll try to fix that for the next one, because I don't futz with the chat setting too much. So I guess that's just how it is on default.
Yeah, but as you were saying, the British intelligence was expanding because poor people were basically not allowed to breed at that time, at least not at a rate that's insane. The fact is that the study showed that British people who lived in the Victorian era had higher IQs than British people today. But that's just not. So what you're basically arguing for is essentially negative eugenics, whereby you incarcerate the people who have high birth rates. You would implement laws that would lead to people who commit these crimes the most to go to prison, and typically the people who commit these crimes are low IQ and impoverished people. So by incarcerating them, you're preventing them from having any communication with the opposite sex, and therefore they don't reproduce anymore. Is that what you're arguing for? Negative
Gotta,
eugenics?
gotta say that. Gotta say that. I gotta jump in on this one as well. This idea of IQ decreasing compared to the 17th and 18th century, I think that was also debunked. Was it not?
I'm not.
The
Well, I'm not
reason
claiming
that we
IQ
Not
is
debunked,
decreasing
but
right
yeah,
now.
the reason,
I don't know
the
about
reason,
that.
I can tell you the reason as well. I can tell you the reason. The reason why it has been debunked is because the people who came out with these statistics forgot somehow to actually measure the fact that people are living longer now and your IQ decreases as you get older, meaning the average which is being taken now is going to be lower than the average taken in the 17th century because the life expectancy is longer. In other words,
well,
you're measuring. Hold on. In other words, if you take an IQ average for the entire population of, let's say, I don't know, someplace in Western Europe or the United States right now, you're including a lot of boomers whose IQs have since decreased.
Yeah, no,
Who
I'm not.
ordinarily
I'm not
would not be
claiming that.
alive to be measured.
No. My claim isn't that IQ is now decreasing or anything like that. I'm just saying
IQ is
that.
I mean, they are
increasing.
plummeting, but you know what? That would be an
Increasing.
argument for bringing back tobacco because it would lower the life expectancy while also bringing about these other bits. We'll get into that later, maybe.
Well, yeah, that's another thing. Talking
David
about
Torini argument.
increasing the death rate, but denying. You were saying something.
I was just making fun of boomers. Just ignore me.
Well, no,
Yeah,
but I think
fuck boomers.
I think my argument wasn't that, or I wasn't saying that IQ is now decreasing again. That wasn't my point. My point was that it's, there is an advantage to simply culling the population of those with lower IQs and instead, having a society of, reasonably intelligent people who are able to more effectively manage resources and more effectively comprehend some wider systemic societal issues that they can then go about dealing with that they wouldn't have been able to if they had been spending resources on simply, propping up the paupers, which I think is like, I think to go back to a point you made earlier, Ray, I think the point about, sort of this double waste of resources where, you got the poor people taking up resources and then you're spending the money to get rid of them. I think what you do is first off, you don't prop up the paupers at all. And the resources you're spending on getting rid of them or putting them to labor or something or other is in the end going to be enough of a net return that the cost is, incredibly minute, even if there is, of course, some dead weight loss to this, like there are with all sort of programs of the state and so forth. There's going to be some dead weight loss in there. But I don't think it's to the point where it's this, massive cost drain any more so than maintaining a police force or some sort of some sort of population control is right now. So
Well, it's probably doable. I'm just the question I'm asking basically is like, why would you choose deliberately to spend on that?
Well, because I think again, it's a philosophical argument, which is
yeah.
sort of.
I'll give you a comparison because this is a comparison I often make where people see the point after I make it in this way. So we're talking about people who are born and are members of your own nation and are born in your nation, right? Would you support the same thing if you were to import, say, I don't know, a couple million unaccompanied migrants from the Middle East and North Africa, for example? Because fundamentally, what is the difference?
Can you restate the question? Because I'm not quite.
Okay, I'll say the question again. You're talking about having these excess people who you then have to run around and police, right? What is the functional difference between deliberately producing excess fetuses, which then grow into children you can't take care of, which then become the problematic persons you just described, versus pulling a Merkel and deliberately importing someone else's problem children and putting them in your country? Aren't these two things literally the same thing? Why would you want to do either of them?
Well, no, because one thing is, first off, it's coming down to sort of a philosophical argument, because the difference between a citizen born here, like a person of a certain nation, and the difference of somebody else coming from another nation and committing crime, it's sort of I don't know how to not put it in, not sound sort of pretentious and overly philosophical about it, but it's sort of a difference of, I guess, metaphysical being. Like a citizen of a nation has a certain different spiritual. Well, no, I don't even have to make this argument. I'll simply say that if you're born a citizen of this nation because your parents are citizen of this nation, then your parents have been paying into the commons of that nation for some time. And part of the return they get is that their children get a chance to participate in that system because they're the ones who have been paying into it in part so that their children can grow up.
Yeah,
And
I
so
mean,
it's only natural that we at least give those children the chance to participate in the civil society of that nation before we deem, all right, this is an undesirable degenerate. We kind of have to, patrol them into being,
No, but I mean,
better.
Yeah, but pragmatic. I do want to ask you one thing.
Technically, think about it in terms of the noodle bowl, though. I mean, how can you really sort out who is paying taxes where, given that we have a global interconnected world? So it may indeed be the case that Syrians, in some weird way, have paid in some way that's caused money to appear in the German treasury, for example.
Okay, well, I think this is one of the problems I run into when I talk about the commons. When I refer to the commons, I'm not simply talking about the tax base on which, Germans and Europeans go to the well for their more progressive spending on social programs. I'm talking more about the cultural commons and the sort of atmosphere of civility that has been built up by the inherited culture of a nation. And so, while taxes are certainly a part of the commons, and of course, so are public utilities and things like that, it's also important to remember that the culture that allows those things to thrive and those programs to be sustainable are just as much as part of the commons, if not more so, because they're the culture that allows them to exist in the first place.
But then that moves the problem to a different location now, because then, okay, if you're going to do it that way and you've successfully isolated it within one country, then so basically potential criminals from outside are somehow are very different from potential criminals that are produced by you inside. Okay, even if you say that, then the society that you're talking about, that you're trying to protect in this case, is going to become very tattered as a result of this kind of behavior. Because what is the psychological effect of having to have the entirety of the society on edge for this large kind of underclass that you're deliberately producing through the use of no birth control, I guess? And what is the psychological effect on law enforcement officers who have to continually go through this kind of thing? I mean, eventually you end up with what Voltaire in the chat would often refer to as a low trust society, because you're not going to have a very high trust society for very long if you keep doing that.
No, I see the point you're making, but first off, I'm unconvinced that, you remove abortion and you remove certain methods of, I should mention right now here, like I'm opposed, of course, to things like the pill and things like condoms, etc. From a moral standpoint, as is my religion. But if it comes down to, St. Thomas Aquinas made the case that you allow certain evils so that greater good in society can flourish. And one of the things he mentioned, like the example he specifically used, was regulating prostitution, so that, you have prostitutes, but at least they're not, the skankiest hookers on the corner or something like that. Probably not what he said, but, you get the idea. I think in, the society of my future, would I like birth control to be outlawed? Yeah. Would it be practical? Probably not. I mean, and I don't think so. Would there be some methods of birth control still around, either legal or black market or otherwise? Yeah. But the only thing I would outright ban is, of course, abortion, because in my eyes, of course, that's just outright murder, and that's worse than all the others combined. And so I'm not convinced that outlawing just abortion would create this huge population of the underclass that would need to be monitored by law enforcement. And I don't think that psychological state that you're talking about would emerge, because I think you're sort of overplaying the size of the underclass I'd be creating.
No, I'm sorry, but outlawing abortion...
Isn't it a massive number of people?
No.
Hold on. Okay. What are you getting at, Nero?
The thing is that if you look at all the statistics, if you look at all the data, the vast majority of abortions are performed on poor people. They're performed on lower class.
They're performed on minorities.
Yeah, but the thing is, but that's what I meant, though. The vast majority of them are poor people.
They're the same thing.
Yeah.
But no, but here's the thing. And so if you outlawed abortion, you are creating an artificial, what's the word? You're creating an artificial block that would prevent these people who would have a shitload of kids otherwise from seeking the very service that stops them or allows them to stop having so many kids. So you would have a dysgenic effect by outlawing abortion, because by outlawing abortion, you would have what Romanians had. You would have the lower classes reproducing like crazy, because the very thing that stopped them from doing so is now gone. So you are creating a dysgenic effect by outlawing abortion. That's why I still argue that even if the fetus is a human life, the fact that it's dependent on the mother and the mother's right to choose to get rid of the very thing that has parasitic characteristics has been beneficial, been a net positive for society, and doing what you're wanting to do, outlawing it completely, has had a net negative effect on every society it's been attempted, including Romania, including most of Africa that's under Catholic control. It's just not feasible, and that's why the mother's
Well,
rights.
allow me to retort
Wait.
for just a second.
Rights are determined by their practicality. Rights are not given to us by nature or God. It's given to us by the fact that if you did not have these rights in society, society would collapse.
Wrong. All right. I'm sorry. No, I just had to. So I do agree with you in some sense that there's a difference between rights practically lived out and practically applied and rights that we believe we have or are given in the abstract. And of course, some might believe that, we have the right to free speech, but, because we're not, and we don't have free speech, that's a violation of that right. But even then, my case doesn't necessarily rest on that. First and foremost, I think when it comes to Romania and outlawing abortion, I think once again, you might have a minor dysgenic effect at first, and then those kids go through
major.
Well, I don't think just, more kids equals larger population equals more criminals. I understand, but that's not necessarily a problem unless the proportion of criminals is actually increasing. Like, obviously, if I have 100 people and 5% of them are criminals, I have 5 criminals. Where if I have 1,000 people and 5% are criminals, now I have 50 criminals. Like, that's just how math works. If the proportion isn't going up, though, you're not actually making society more criminal. You're just, because the population is larger, you're just getting more criminals. It's an issue with sort of per capita, so to speak. And so I don't necessarily think that just because we have a larger population, and yes, we will get more criminals because, larger population and some section of that population is always going to be criminal, is enough of a reason to just say, well, we should let them choose whether or not this person lives or dies. Especially because, who is to say who is going to become a criminal or not? Like, unless you have been paying very close attention to specific metrics and specific correlates and stuff like that for every individual person, it's very hard to tell. I do admit it's certainly not impossible to tell, and you can keep a close eye on people and sort of predict this stuff. But there's plenty of you can do just that. You don't have to manage it by killing them outright before they've even done anything wrong. You don't have to kill them before they've even committed a crime. There's no need for that amount of preemptive justice. And furthermore, I think once you get past that dysgenic state, if you actually bring the hammer of the law down effectively enough, like they did in England with those laws that Ray mentioned earlier, you cull that population outright in the beginning. And so eventually it goes back to the way it was because of, just how harsh the laws are without abortion. And so I don't think there is this need for abortion in order to, reduce the criminal population or reduce the low IQ population.
But before Ray gets into debunking,
I have a different question.
Wait.
Let me finish, and then I'll let you.
Okay, go on.
I'm not. Before Ray goes on to debunking the whole Romania shit, I do have to ask though, because I wanted to get a little bit into illegal immigration and tobacco, because I'm sponsored by Marlboro. I'm just kidding. I wanted to get into illegal immigration very quickly. So after Ray makes her point and you make your response, can we move on to discussing overpopulation in the United States specifically, since most of us are Americans?
Okay, so are you just not going to respond to the thing, or are you going to let Ray respond? I'm going
to let Ray respond. I really don't have much to say.
Okay.
Okay, so I've got questions.
In the US,
I have many questions.
Okay.
So, with regards to this thing where you say that you consider abortion to be murder, and I know we went over this before, but I'm having to bring it back again. You say that abortion is murder, but then somehow, if you get the state to engage in hunting down vagabonds, quote unquote, and brutally imprisoning and or murdering people in certain contexts, then that's suddenly not murder. So it's very strange to me that terminating a blastocyst is murder, but literally killing a human being in the street is not.
It's not.
No, hold on. I never said it wasn't not murder. I just have to say, I think it's the idea
justified.
The idea being it's more justified because it's not just,
Really?
you're
justified by what? Justified by capital?
Hold on. It's not simply that you're just hunting down vagabonds, so to speak. It's more like you're making it acceptable to discriminate against them for what we would consider, broken windows kind of thing. It's basically broken windows policing on like hyper steroids. And so it's not that they've committed a crime at some point. They've done something wrong. They haven't just been poor.
No, but you've arbitrarily decided that the behavior which is associated with poverty is now criminal. So, for example, like simply not being in work would now be seen as somehow criminal.
Well, I don't think it would be. What'd you say, Denai?
It is criminal. It's the most criminal fucking thing I've ever heard.
No, but really though, it's almost like you sit down and you then criminalize everything to then make it legal to carry out incredibly coercive action against people who are not asking for it. But then at the same time, you'll spin around the next second and say that you can't terminate a blastocyst because that's violence.
Well, hold on. It's not simply that. It's, how did you put it? It's not arbitrary. I'm not completely power deranged.
I've got Seth Alpha here in the chat as well, asking very similar questions. For example, I'm just going to tweet out a couple of his statements earlier as well.
Who is this?
Seth Alpha, one of the guys who is in the chat. He asks, why not just trust the conscience of women who don't want to be used as breeding vessels? And then he also says here, for example, being unemployed is not a crime. Both of those statements sound true to me. Being unemployed is not a crime, clearly. Otherwise, I think you'd have, 8% of the US population who would be in serious trouble. And also,
what would happen if you?
In his question about why don't you just trust the conscience of women who don't want to be used as breeding vessels? Good question. Why don't you?
Like, who trusts women anyway, man? They're fucking women. But no, in all seriousness, I don't trust their conscience because they're deciding to take a life that's, had literally no chance, A, not to do anything wrong, but B, it hasn't committed a crime. It hasn't committed a crime itself, A. B, how do you know? Like, why should I trust their conscience? Give me a reason in the first place to trust them. Like, I don't get this idea that I'm just supposed to, like, outright accept, like, these women's choice that, when they choose to murder the developing child within them, it's always going to be good. Like, I haven't been given proof that I should have that level of trust in them. That seems, rather odd to me. But, and this, but again, the second point, they've done nothing wrong. Give me a reason to trust them in the first place. But to address the other thing about being unemployed and not being employed as a crime, that's not what I'm saying. You can be unemployed, and that's not the crime. The crime is when you then proceed to just leech off the commons with no intent of re-entering the workforce and becoming a contributing member of society again.
Who decides what that is? Because, I mean, let's say the scenario is after 2008, and, like, you're in the United States, so, like, your population was completely messed up during that time period, right? And I'm exaggerating slightly because it completely was not really what happened, but, a significant amount of messed up went on. So at what point, after how many weeks, do you decide that the person is now suddenly a criminal?
Well, I don't think it's a matter of weeks that they're unemployed. Sometimes it's just tough to find a job. I think the matter is, like, the U.S. sort of unemployment system has a system that works it out pretty well. You have to prove that you're actually searching for a job, that you're trying to regain bountiful employment in some sense. It's the difference between somebody who's unemployed and somebody who's, no longer in participating in the labor force. Like, somebody who is retired is increasing the the amount of people who are not participating in the labor force, whereas somebody who's doesn't have a job and is looking for one is just unemployed. And I think that's the distinction you make. People who are unemployed ought to be, looking for the job. Whereas if you're choosing to just leave the labor force altogether and it's not because of retirement, that's the crime. Not unemployment necessarily, but leaving the labor force altogether.
Okay, well, in the context of the US, isn't it like 11% of your population that's basically just left the labor force and can't be bothered, quote unquote, because we don't know the real reason, of course. But according to your logic, it would be can't be bothered to get back into it. What would you do with them then?
Well, hold on. I just want to answer some quotes from Enver real quick. Criminalize retirees. No, if they're retiring and they're living off their own money, that's fine. You can be retired and not in the labor force. Wait
a second. What do you think of Medicare and Social Security then? Because technically that's not living off their own money then.
Well, Medicare and Social Security and things like that are things that were paid for with their taxes. So again, that's them paying into the commons and them getting out of the commons what they put in, essentially. Now, another question to be brought up there is also economic sustainability of these things, which we kind of discussed last time, but that is a different issue. But I would say they paid into the commons, and because Medicaid and Social Security are a part of the commons, they're just getting out what they paid in. So it's a different sort of form. It's a government 401k, essentially. But another thing I just want to mention before I just to answer another one of Enver's quotes, he says, "I'll take the conscience of the first 10 women on the phone book over all the police officers in the world." And I genuinely have to ask why. Like, I'm not saying, you have to take the conscience of like the police officers as moral law or code or whatever. Like, that's not my point. I'm just wondering, why trust these women over police officers? Like, what's the reason? That's the question for me. I haven't been given a reason to trust them, more so than, people trying to make laws to better society or, what have you. I just haven't been given a reason to trust them. Like, I'm not saying you have to trust police officers more or anyone more. I just don't know why you would trust them. I also need to slow down.
Well, the counter question
to Sue Talfa. I'm sorry, I speak fast.
Well, the counter question I'd put to this, which is more of a framework question, is that all of this violence which you're discussing here, right? All of this occurs within the context of satisfying the system of capitalist development which presently exists. So basically, like, what are we talking about here? Like, Goldman Sachs can essentially sit down and create a complete disaster, for example. Like, you can imagine a number of ways in which large banks can create disasters in the economy, and then your reaction would be to immediately proceed to chasing down the vagabonds.
Well, no, I think economic.
Do you see why you would end up sparking immediately a working class revolution against you? Hypothetically speaking, if you were the leader of a country.
Well, hold on. My view isn't so unnuanced that I assume that, because of an economic downturn, we just have a sudden spike of vagabonds, guess we have to all hunt them down. My view isn't so unnuanced as that. I would personally start with hanging, the execs of Goldman Sachs.
What you're arguing for is essentially.
Well, that's also bad too, though. You can't. Hold on. I have to respond to that before we go on. You can't just hang executives of companies when they do things that are bad either, because then they don't get to learn from the experience.
No. I get it. That was hyperbole, obviously. But my point is that I don't blame people that in an economic downturn, when they've suddenly, lost work or having a tougher time going through it. I understand that there are certain economic external factors that are going to happen, that are going to result in, these things happening. And so my view isn't so unnuanced that, if there's a sudden spike because of some catastrophic event, that all of a sudden all these new fresh people have to be hunted down because they're definitely not contributing members of society. I wouldn't do that, just to clarify. But Nero, what were you saying?
Enver's answer, by the way.
All I was really going to say was just a simplification of what you're actually arguing for, which is actually not too far off from what Malthus argued for. But what you're basically arguing for is a more social Darwinian perspective when it comes to free market capitalism, which was very popular before Adolf Hitler. Actually, what's interesting is that prior to the National Socialists coming to power in Germany, most conservatives borrowed social Darwinist talking points to justify their policies. But it wasn't until the Holocaust became public knowledge. Once that came public knowledge, the Holocaust, conservatives basically cucked, and now they tried doing this stupid shit like saying that liberalism, modern liberalism, like Bernie Sanders, is social Darwinism, or that atheism necessarily leads to social Darwinism. It's absolutely pathetic, but honestly, they cucked because Hitler. That's really what it comes down to. But
Well,
it looks like he didn't cuck, so.
yeah, well, that's the thing. I'm not a free market social Darwinist because I don't believe the market is actually an effective tool for social Darwinism. That's sort of the nuance I would slide in there. That let's not use the market for social Darwinism, but just to hold on. There is something Enver said in the chat, but let me see. Let me see if I can pull it up real quick. Just give me a second.
But not all we really had to say though, because I kind of wanted to get into U.S.
Oh, okay. I see the point Enver is making now. It's like this is exact. They're talking about we're either having women do the eugenics or the police. Well, no, it's not the police themselves doing the eugenics. It's the people. Like the police are just law enforcers. They didn't make the laws. It's the people who are making the laws that are essentially having the police carry out the eugenics of sorts. I think whether or not it's soft eugenics or some sort of negative eugenics is one thing. So yeah, I get that, but presumably, you don't just have people making up laws willy-nilly. Of course, that's the goal. Whether that happens is a question of who you put in power. And of course, I choose not to vote people into power because I think the mob is almost always wrong. Like 90% failure rate with the mob, probably 95%. I'm being a little too generous, but other issues that we've discussed before we'd get into a different discussion. Well, you were saying something, Nero?
No, I mean, I just wanted to jump topics a little to overpopulation in the U.S. See, me and Ray, at least...
Oh, sure.
Me and Ray argued that because most of what we'll be talking about later on in the stream, I believe, is MENA migration, Middle East, North Africa migration, and overpopulation in Africa. But to avoid bias, we also wanted to discuss overpopulation in the first world. And what better way to start off with that than the U.S., which dives a little bit.
Technically, we've already been doing that, given that, as far as I understand it,
that's all we've been discussing.
Pragmatic culture will be reducing what we would describe as overpopulation in the first world then.
Oh, yeah. Well, but the thing is, I wanted to dive a little bit into the U.S. specifically, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, well, I'd be interested to hear what you mean by overpopulation in the first world, because in my view, it's not the first world that's really overpopulated. Like, you could make the claim that certain areas are overpopulated, like certain urban areas and things like that. But I don't think the nation as a whole is overpopulated. Like, I think there's plenty of land that we could, spread out to or whatnot.
Keep in mind that I perceive overpopulation as a global phenomena, in which, because even if you distinguish borders, the fact is that human population itself, regardless of racial differences or whatever, we are all humans. So in essence, if a person in Nigeria has 10 children, and a person in the United States only has 2 children, that's 12 children in total, in my opinion. It's still a global phenomena, but it has different material manifestations based on geographical differences. But I just want to clarify that. I do think it's a global problem, overpopulation. But of course, it has different manifestations based on different geographical and geopolitical contexts. I just wanted to clarify that.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, no, I get what you're saying. I think I'm still kind of with you in that I think, again, I don't believe that there's a certain number that will hit and it's like, oh, this is too much, we're all doomed. But I do think the rate at which we've done it has gotten out of hand and that this requires some sort of fixing. I don't think, though, that there's a reason to look to the first world and say we should fix it here. Because one, I don't think the first world is the main problem. And I don't think the first world are the only ones who are actually concerned about it in the first place. So if you do in the first world, you're eliminating people who are actually concerned about the problem at all.
Yeah, but what I really wanted to get into, though, was, as I said earlier, Malthus predicted that human population growth will exceed the supplies of these necessities of life. And I have some statistics right here from a right-wing website called the acronym for it is Ferris. I forgot what that meant. Ferris. The Federation for American Immigration Reform. So, unfortunately, because deporting illegal immigrants, bringing justice to people who basically screw over those who are trying to come in here legally, that's a right-wing issue. You can't be left-wing without being against it. But for all intents and purposes, this is a right-wing source. So I want to read you some statistics they cite for overpopulation and why inviting third world immigrants or granting amnesty to illegal immigrants is a bad idea. So this will take a while, but it's probably less of a tangent than what Ray gave earlier. No offense, Ray.
All right, sure, go for it.
On a yearly basis, 3 million acres of farmland is lost due to population growth, and that's fueled by suburban development. As birth rates rise, suburban development rises, and that drastically hurts agriculture. As agriculture is becoming more and more geared towards production of fuel as opposed to food, CO2 being pushed into the atmosphere is also increasing. Now, this is a really drastic statistic. Really drastic point. 500 species in the U.S. have went extinct, and 6,700 are easily prone to extinction. Because suburban development grows as population grows, and the fact that over half of the land in the U.S. is being used as a source for the population's victuals, more and more species will face extinction. Now, that's 6,700 species that are basically on the brink of extinction because of the consequences of population growth. Allow me to continue. Between 1947 and 2007, the population grew at 41.7%, while the consumption of energy rose by 37.1%. There's a clear correlation between higher fertility rates and greenhouse gas emissions. Oregon State University found that when a woman gives birth to 3 children, her carbon footprint is 60 times more potent than doing quote other environmentally sensitive practices, such as people might employ their entire lives, things like driving a high mileage car, recycling, or using energy efficient appliances and light bulbs, end quote. Almost done. Since European colonization, only 5% of all original forests remain, while all other forests are younger and less diverse. And the overconsumption of water, now this directly correlates with what Malthus predicted, the overconsumption of water, the average American drinking 550,000 gallons a year strongly correlates with increases in water pollution. 46% of all lakes and 50% of all estuaries are too polluted for fishing or swimming. So, since as population size increases, the supply of clean water decreases. So Malthus essentially predicted something that's occurring in the United States today. But yeah, these are all the arguments that are backed up by government and other primary sources for why granting amnesty to illegal immigrants is a bad idea, because there's so many of them. Keeping them around is ecologically bad, right? But I also would use this as an argument for population control, because everything they brought up involving the growth of populations strongly correlates with ecological destruction. And most of what I just gave to you, by the way, besides greenhouse gas emissions, doesn't relate to climate change. It relates specifically to overconsumption. Anyway, I'm done with my tangent, and I apologize, Ray.
Okay, no problem, because it's given me an opportunity to say something that needs to be said.
Ooh.
Do you know that you wouldn't even have to be dealing with this problem if certain individuals didn't decide this year that they were going to start messing with NAFTA? Because NAFTA was a source first of inflows, but then of outflows of immigrants specifically from Mexico to the United States. So the longer NAFTA remained in place, the less of that you were going to get, because of the fact that obviously it was creating jobs inside Mexico. It's just causing less people to leave, and it was in fact causing people to go back to Mexico.
Well,
right?
all right, all right.
And so, no, I'm not finished yet.
Okay,
The thing which you guys are now grappling with is the other facet, which was self-inflicted, which was that some geniuses decided it would be a really wonderful idea to destroy El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala in the 1970s and 1980s, and then after having done so, instead of withdrawing the paramilitaries which had been sent down there to do the destruction for reasons which are obvious, instead they just left them where they were. Let me finish. They just left them where they were, and they morphed into criminal gangs which are terrorizing people across those countries, which has created what's called the triangle. What's it called? The triangle of something. It's something horrible. But either which way, so people have fled. Well, hold on. People have fled those places.
In another live stream.
Yes, but I mean, I'm just repeating it again. But basically, people have fled those places. Let me finish.
Hold on.
Let me finish though. People have left those places and headed to the United States in order to escape from the scenarios that were created. So it's not like this suddenly popped out of nowhere. One way to have solved this initially without having to actually engage in human rights violations would have been to not have done the initial human rights violations.
Well, too late
and
now.
Additionally to have not messed with NAFTA. They could have just left NAFTA in place. Why is Donald Trump interfering with NAFTA? You would think that if he wanted less immigrants in the United States, that he would just not touch NAFTA and leave it exactly as it was.
Yeah, okay, I agree with that point, but I want Pragmatic to respond to all the points I just made about
the. Well, first off, I'll respond. Let me just briefly respond to Ray quickly, and then I'll get to what you all the statistics you brought up, Nero.
Very well.
First and foremost, I don't think that to deal with the paramilitary stuff. I don't know why the United States today has to be held responsible for the sins of people not only that this generation didn't vote for, but that people that this generation would be vehemently opposed to today. And so while I agree those actions were stupid, it's just to say, all right, well, now we have to inflict these people upon your population because you screwed up in the past.
Oh no, there's another solution to that too, which would have been, of course, to have spent more time repairing the problem in the location where it was created. But what you have is the vicious cycle of people who don't want to spend money in their near neighborhood, which is kind of ironic given that the Monroe Doctrine made it your near neighborhood and no one else's, right? People who don't want to spend money in their near neighborhood to repair what they did, but also they don't want the migrants from the imploding. No, but what I'm saying is that it's a two-way trap here. They don't want to spend money to fix the problem in the location in which it's occurring, but they also don't want people to flee the problem either. So what are they supposed to do?
Well, first off, the paramilitary weren't the problem to begin with. They were sent to fix a problem, and then they became the problem. And so, yes, our attempts failed. But eventually, the people don't want us to fix it either. It's sort of what's happened in certain places in the Middle East. You get involved, you go in, you try to fix a problem, and initially the people go in and they support you, and then you stay there long enough, and all of a sudden, you're just as bad as the problem you came to solve, and you get booted out. Like, we lose public support over time so that it makes us impossible to take any further action. But even beyond that, I don't know, just to respond to the NAFTA thing briefly, I don't know what Trump has been futzing with NAFTA. In my mind, it looks like, it hasn't been this, bad deal for Mexico. It looks like it's been a fine deal for both groups. So I don't understand why it would stop creating jobs in Mexico.
What he seems to have done is, if you take it at its word, what they seem to have done is that they've raised the level of inputs to 75% that have to come from within North America for it to be counted for the reduction in tariffs. And what else did they do? They did something else to it as well. I just can't remember what it is right now. Usually I'd be able to recite this instantly, but for some reason it's left my head. But either which way, they've messed with it. And so, assuming that his intention is to actually make this happen so that NAFTA does not work the way it's supposed to have worked before, or for example, say they leave Canada out of it or something like this, right? Worst case scenario, he will have produced a scenario in which the migration to the US will have been incentivized further.
Well, excuse me. I don't deny that. Obviously, we have. Excuse me for just. Sorry about that. Obviously, you have a wealthy country that is the United States. More jobs being created in Mexico is obviously going to incent people to stay down there. But I don't think the rate at which it was incentivizing people to stay is that great, because we were still receiving massive amounts of illegal immigration. I'm not saying it didn't help, but I don't think futzing with it is going to make it enough of a difference to want us to, offset American prosperity. Because, that's when Trump goes in and futzing with this NAFTA, he's doing it to increase American prosperity. And of course, prosperity on our end is going to incentivize more people to come here. But I don't see necessarily why, just because it's going to incentivize them to come here doesn't mean we're not going to stop them anyway. Still waiting on the wall, but I don't believe it's, I don't think just because we're prosperous means, and it's going to be incentivized more, doesn't mean we have to just sit back and take it, of course. But to get to Nero now, because he brought up a lot of points, and I think I can try to respond to them all somewhat summarily, in that obviously the effects he was talking about are correlated with an increase of population, and of course as population grows, less drinking water, less living space, all these, negative sort of effects continue to go up. But I don't believe necessarily, while it proved, the negative effects of an ever increasing population, I don't think it necessarily set out to prove overpopulation. I think it was just asking for a cap on sort of population growth.
No,
at
the
least
article explicitly, I'm sorry, I have to interject in that. The
Sure,
article explicitly calls it overpopulation. In fact, I'll just link it to our DM chat, the source I just used.
Sure.
Let me go find it.
Well,
but
no,
yeah, they explicitly call it proofs of overpopulation. Yep, it's called the United States is already overpopulated. Here you go. Enjoy.
Okay. Well, no, I don't think that, I understand they're calling it overpopulation and they're using this as proofs of overpopulation, but I don't think then that their claim, that their data goes out to prove what it claims. Because I think it's just proving that, the more we continue to populate, it's bad. But, overpopulation is a very specific term, and it's a point. Overpopulation is a point at which, presumably there's a lot more negative things happening than just, some of our water is undrinkable. So we're slowly running out of certain, spaces to inhabit. I understand that increased population is going to have negative effects, but overpopulation sort of has a more ominous connotation to it. You know what I mean? And I don't.
What they're really saying is that as population grows, things like biodiversity are threatened. Again, like suburban development, the growth.
Yeah, and the extinct species. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the extinction of species is not something that can be simply ignored, because we have a food chain, and if you disrupt that food chain, all hell breaks loose.
I understand what you're saying, and I think you're right. These are ecological issues that can't be ignored, and I think what this proves, though, is not so much that we currently are overpopulated, but that we are on the path to it. I think it's set up a sort of model to watch and see how it progresses. But at the same time, I also think, it seems like there's a going back point. It seems like once you're overpopulated, and there's no turning back. But at this point, I feel like, we can sort of prevent the apocalypse at this point. I don't think, I think these guys, in trying to be sort of modern Malthusians, sort of predicted as you put it, predicted the apocalypse in the next 5 minutes, when I think, their own data suggests that that's not really the case.
Yeah. I'm just highly pessimistic. I'm just a natural pessimist. So I kind of expect humans to fuck up and eventually die out as a species because of the mistakes we've been unable to overcome these past 10,000 years. But so I imagine you don't have really much to say about what I just said, but I would like to say another thing that the Ferris article mentions, and that is an argument that that partially relates to what Ray will use as an argument against MENA migration, and that is a whole argument that what is the argument? That in order for economic growth to be achieved, you need mass immigration, especially if the birth rates in the home country are low. You need immigration, or you need higher population growth. And this is why academic agent had sort of an indifference towards higher fertility rates. It's saying this, it has the logic of a Ponzi scheme, basically. It only works if population growth is endless. But we know that defies common sense, since anyone with a functioning brain realizes that there are circumstances in which the population size is too big. Japan radically lowered fertility rates and will lose 20% of its current population by 2050 as a result, and they still compete with countries like China.
Yes, and not only that, I was going to mention that in response to what Pragmatic had said earlier as well about the prosperity inside the country of origin that's developing the product. Yeah, not only is the population decreasing, but also massive offshoring has been occurring in Japan for quite a long time, since the 1980s, and it's almost like a hockey stick in terms of the amount of offshoring that's presently going on. And so you'd think, oh, well, this means that Japan is going to be in big trouble economically. No. Instead, corporate Japan has generated 1.5 trillion yen more from its use of intellectual property offshore than it's spent for the last half year ending 30th of June 2018. That's apparently a 30% jump on the year, setting a new record since data became available in 1996. And most of that apparently is occurring in drug and automobile sectors. So in the drug sector, that's mostly Europe, right? And in the automobile sector, that's just like global, because of the fact that obviously Japan has been offshoring its automotive sector for the longest time now, which is why many Japanese cars are not actually assembled in Japan, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so Japan is still making money off that, despite the fact that that is not actually occurring inside the country. It just means that Japan does not have the migration magnet thing happening. Because people in Southeast Asia, for example, do not have to travel to Japan in order to get a job assembling cars, because the car factories are all in Southeast Asia anyway.
Okay, I'm sorry. I lost your point somewhere on there. I got the data you were saying, but what was the point you were making?
The point that I was making is compare it back to what you said to me about 10 minutes ago, where I told you that implementing NAFTA would reduce the level of migration, but then you argued that it also reduces the level of prosperity if you do that in the United States. So my claim is that that is not true, because of the fact that these cars, these American cars, are still your intellectual property, and the factories are still owned by the companies which are resident in the US, which you are taxing.
Okay, well, this kind of goes back to what we were talking about last stream as to who is receiving that prosperity, because obviously Japan is doing well, but Japan is also a very high IQ and culturally homogenous country, which is able to perform a lot of jobs that the US just can't, because we don't have the intellectual capacity to as a populace. And so being that we have to cater to a population that sort of needs lower level jobs, some of this prosperity can't simply be measured in the amount of wealth we make or the amount of revenue we collect. It also has to be measured in, does the population have jobs? Is the whole population making some sort of a livable wage? And I think some of that has to be accomplished through, preserving some jobs that otherwise we would be, in a libertarian sense, being better off exporting because, much cheap goods and such. But prosperity is more than just the economic sense of it.
Okay, but I mean, to be fair, even if we use the IQ measurements that presently exist, if we want to base it on IQ, right? The IQ in Japan right now is what is it? Mean IQ is 105, right?
In the United States, 107. In China, it's 105.
No, cannot be, because South Korea is at 106, and someone else is higher than that, but Japan is not at the top. As far as I'm aware, Japan is at 105. Okay, let's call it 107 for now to satisfy you. But what is in the United States then? It's 101, right?
Say that again. Sorry.
It's 101 in the United States.
U.S. population, right? IQ
on
average is 99, but it's projected to go to 95 by 2030.
Really?
I think. I'm quoting from memory, and I wish I had the source with me.
I just Googled it, and it said it says IQ research. I have no clue if this is a reliable source. It's just the first result that came up in Google, but it actually says the result is that our average is 98, but maybe, I don't know, maybe our median is different. Yeah, close enough.
Okay, close enough. So let's say that we have 98 then, versus 105. So I say the lower end on both of these two things. Is that difference, which is, I guess, almost about half a standard deviation, let's say, is that difference really enough to cause the profound effects that you're describing, where basically you're going to have to go around essentially like a nursemaid handing make work jobs to people?
Well, it has to do with the shift.
even because India is slightly under that. I think India is something like, what is it, 93 or something like that, and India is not behaving the way that you're presently advocating the US should behave.
Well, I think it has to do with, of course, like, the shifting of the bell curve for each nation in terms of IQ, because obviously, those are the averages for each of their IQ. And then the populations, of course, there's differences in the standard deviation and the portion. But when you say India isn't behaving the way we're behaving in terms of like it's not protecting its jobs, like it's exporting, what is it doing?
India used to behave the way that you're advocating, and it wasn't very successful for reasons which have been explained with much ink spill over the years.
Yeah, India is.
Yeah, because
India
it's
is
the
a good example of overpopulation.
And misapplication of protectionism in various ways, right? And so obviously, India's population is on a downward trend now because they adopted the correct policy prescriptions in that regard. So, on the protectionism issue, they're overcoming this because of the fact that Japan made its personal projects to try to get India to actually join the regional comprehensive economic partnership by actually cutting their tariffs and stop asking for like weird exemptions and various crony actions to be taken in their favor. And so that's one of the biggest projects for the regional comprehensive economic partnership, was how to get India to behave itself when brought on board. And I think we've just about got that done. And so they are going in the opposite direction than the one you were suggesting. Now, you would think that if this was some kind of like IQ related thing, that they would be following you in that direction, but they're not.
Well, the reason they're getting the reason they don't have to worry about that so much is because they're not the ones that are exporting jobs to nations that have relatively lower IQs. They are the lower IQ nation where jobs are being exported to. So the free market and trade.
I'm sure they're actually going to they're going to be exporting things while receiving other things, because obviously Japan is going to invest in India, but then India is going to be exporting jobs to Africa or to parts of Central Asia, and that was why they had the crony problem in the first place, because obviously there were people in India who didn't want to be exporting those jobs to those locations, and so it took many years of grinding them down to get them to finally accept the reality, which is that if you protect these industries, they're still going to collapse eventually one day once they get exposed to actual competition, because then they'll be too weak.
Yeah, of course there's going to... I'm sorry, Nero, go ahead.
Okay. Just very quickly. The reason why this goes into what Ray was just saying, and what you said earlier about how even though Africans and Muslims, or Arabs to be more technical, even though they're immigrating to first world countries, they still maintain the fertility rates they had at home, and to an extent it's worse, because in these countries they were a lot more poorer, so therefore they had a higher death rate. But now that they're in a country with a very low death rate, they have more kids overall. So, and Ray just mentioned the whole you can just export the jobs. Yeah, the thing is, the reason why MENA immigration is unnecessary is because, one, the European population was already below the carrying capacity, and it was likely they were going to see the trend Japan had, and that is the population size is going to decrease by a lot, but it wouldn't. But that's what Europe was going to see. Europe was going to see a trend similar to Japan had they not imported all these immigrants from the Middle East and North Africa. But there's two reasons why they never had to import those workers to begin with. First, there's automation, which can easily replace all the jobs that nobody else wants to do, but poor immigrants do anyway. And second, instead of having people from these poor countries immigrate to your country, you instead send your jobs over to their country. So instead of doing the jobs in your country, they just do it in their country for a much more cost-effective manner. So what you do is outsource or offshore, and you also incentivize automation. That's how you would decrease the so-called need to expand population growth for the sake of economic growth. But which I said earlier, it uses the logic of a Ponzi scheme, so it doesn't work.
Also, Satalfa in the chat is asking a funny question. Well, asking more like making a statement that I thought was pretty funny here, where he says America is like playing civilization on easy mode.
That's
But
true.
yeah, you get a continent surrounded by 2 oceans with a plethora of natural resources and weak natives. How do you screw that up unless you research the wrong technology first?
Well, I don't.
Exactly. How did you guys get into the position where you've gone from advocating free trade and then getting everyone else into line behind that position to now somehow being like, oh, poor us, we need to like rig the entire planet in order to make it so that we can actually win, even though we're playing on easy mode already?
Well, I do think there's a lot of
nothing
black
from
pilling
Lyndon
amongst
LaRouche.
America. Sorry, go on, denying.
No, I was just making a shit post. We watched this one documentary a long time ago from Lyndon LaRouche, and he's like some stupid guy. And he said that like America was super protectionist in the past.
Are you referring to True Diltom?
No, Lyndon LaRouche. Don't worry about it. I was just making a joke.
Okay.
Oh well, what I would say is that I think there's a fair bit of black pilling amongst the American populace about how bad things really are. I don't really think. Obviously, in terms of national spirits, we always think things are worse than they are. I blame the media, at least in part, for that. But you're right. We are in easy mode. Most things aren't really going to be that bad for us, and they're not that bad for us. We just want things to be better. So I don't think it's so much that. I do think there's a certain amount of playing the victim card, but I think that's sort of just playing the victim is sort of what's popular in the culture at the moment. But there's also just the idea of we want things to be better. And we see it as such that our jobs and our such are they took our gerbs. They're being exported to places other in the world where when we ourselves could do them, even if it's going to lead to a slightly higher cost or things like that, which is debatable still in some sense. But I think Americans see prosperity in terms of, as I've brought up before, more than just economics. And so that's one of the reasons I think they're so black-pilled, is because they see culture as being sort of fucked up, and they see, economics as just a part of it. And so they're trying to get a hold on what they can. And the most effective bargaining chip, or the most easily influenced part of American prosperity that can be influenced by elections on the federal level or on the state level or whatever, is always the economy. And so that's just sort of what we're going for first at the moment. Although, we switch up. I don't know where I was going. Yeah, we just don't know what we want because we're stupid. But it's also not as bad as it is because we're stupid. But
well, there's also the fact here of on the cultural level that you're talking about here. It's kind of strange to me that they're so upset about the way that the culture has gone as well, because I mean it could be worse, right? And I hate to say it that way because obviously people always say it could be worse, right? I mean, what are the countries adjacent to you like? Like, does anyone want to go live in them in comparison to living in like standard suburb in the United States, for example? Or I don't know. It is difficult to explain how big the contrast is because there's a giant continent, it's North America, and most of the things that happen in North America seem to be relatively nice. Whereas if you were to, by comparison, take, say, the continent of Asia, and you were to like divide up nice versus not nice, you probably have over 50% of what's going on is not nice.
Yeah, no, it is.
I mean, because of course Asia includes Central Asia as well, right? So you're including everything from the edge of the eastern side of the Japanese coast to basically the Khyber Pass in Afghanistan, right? And so if you're going to go between there and there, then I mean the number of problems which are ranging between those longitudes, it's just ridiculous, right?
Yeah, no.
I mean, by comparison, the US has no problems.
Oh yeah, sure, certainly by comparison, but of course, nobody wants to see the big picture. I believe if we did, we'd be a much happier people. And there certainly wouldn't be this rise in radical politics like there is now. But of course, you can't convince people to see the big picture because they want to focus on the small picture because it makes their life seem that much worse and it gives them much more room to complain. And
also, Enver raises an interesting point here, just jumping in with this, where he says the US made the conscious decision to absorb Spanish-speaking territories and to become an empire, which is an interesting thing because it does actually make the comparison I just made not exactly accurate, because the US chose to expand to the point where it was embracing these population groups that it doesn't necessarily gel with all that well apparently right now, right? Whereas in the case of the Asia I just described, I mean, technically we never chose to actually have Islam, for example, in Asia. It entered Asia without anyone's permission.
Yeah, well, I think some of it isn't that the reason we went to war and absorbed so many of those American territories is not because they were Spanish speaking, is because there was a large set population of white settlers in there. And, that's how the Texas independence movement started, is because, they were sort of white people depopulating the native Mexican population. And they decided, well, we're white. Why are we a part of Mexico now? We're independent. And that's sort of how we ended up absorbing most of those territories. So it's not quite accurate to say that we absorbed Spanish-speaking territories when in reality they were becoming less and less Spanish-speaking as we were absorbing them.
Well, this is true, but then that also raises another challenge, which I'll put in there as well, which is that the same, I guess you could say, white people, let's say European people who had come down there from the United States in the first place and were moving in, they were all there first off illegally. Right? And then second off, not only were they illegal while they were occupying the territory, they had also brought people with them who they had explicitly asked not to bring. Who am I referring to?
Oh, you're talking your slaves, yeah.
Yeah, of course. So they said, do not bring African slaves into the territory, right? Because they had foresight, I guess, let's say. And what did the oh so wise white Americans decide to do? Violate that as well. And so they ended up with essentially bringing African slavery into locations in which people did not want it. Not only that, but then you even have like sort of American folk heroes like Andrew Jackson. What is Andrew Jackson most famous for? Other than the
New Orleans Trail of Tears.
Yeah, other than that, what is he most famous for? Because there was something he did after that which was very important. Nobody knows, right? Okay, so basically, basically what he did after that, after he had finished essentially demolishing Native Americans in the southeast of the United States, what did he replace them with? An array of plantations on which to put what? African slaves, am I right?
Did he do that, or was that sort of just the consequence of what he did?
That was the consequence, but it was a deliberate consequence of what he did, though. Like he knew that was what was going to happen. That's why it happened. So this is.
Hold on. This is I've never heard this before.
You've never heard it described that way? Okay.
No.
Well, basically, he knew what the people who were backing him wanted to do in these locations. So when he evicted the Native Americans from their territory, he knew that there were going to be slave plantations placed on those territories afterwards. So it's almost like the quote problem, the ethnic such and such problem, which they keep talking about. Like if you turn to Fox News on any given day, they're talking about it. Even if they're not really talking about it, they're still talking about it, right? They act as though this thing was like an act of, I don't know, some kind of aliens came down in like flying saucers and just beamed Africans into these locations or something, and that somehow Hispanics are in collaboration with them or somehow Native
I don't know
Americans
if that's quite how I'd put it, but I see what you're saying.
Exactly. It's almost like it's the exact opposite of that. They literally created this problem themselves and are now running around blaming literally everyone they can lay their hands on.
Create that problem. Let's be honest here.
I mean, white America specifically invented this problem. No one else wanted it.
So slavery
is something like
it's
everyone else's fault.
No, well, hold on. I agree that we should not have had slavery. Slavery was a bad thing. It was not good to import this foreign population here and have them pick cotton for us and so forth and so on.
But now they're calling for an ethno-state in the same location, which they previously cleaned out in order to insert these very same people who they're blaming everyone else for the presence of. And I'll give you a concrete example. I'm talking about the alt-right now here specifically, although there's a Tucker Carlson connection there which can bring you to that, but I won't even do that. I'll just go straight to the alt-right. What was Richard Spencer's foreparents involved in?
I don't know Richard Spencer's genealogy. I just don't care enough about it.
Cotton farming.
is he from Southern aristocracy? Wow, that's really
because there is no layer of irony which has not been explored here in this whole fantastical thing that's been happening since 2016. Well, 2008 really, but 2016 when people started to notice it. I'm really disappointed in him now, because if he's really Southern aristocracy, then fucking he should be doing better than he is right now. He's still making money off the cotton thing right now as well, by the way. Apparently cotton is still being grown, and he's still making money off it.
That doesn't surprise me, because he has cash out the wazoo.
Yep, apparently his mother controls it or something. It's incredible. It is incredible.
That's great. Incredible. That's amazing.
And so this is
because I'm not a fan of Richard Spencer either. So
yeah, I'm not saying that you were, but I'm just using him as an example here. And so
no, this is hysterical. I'm loving this.
And so you have to understand that from the perspective of like people of color in the US, for example, once people become aware of these things, it becomes absolutely ridiculous. When you have these guys going around calling for the ethno-state on the territory which they occupied, into which they introduced the problem that they're now complaining about.
Well, hold on. You're talking about then, as in white Americans broadly, both past and present. And I don't agree with that sort of framing of the situation, because I agree there were some white Americans who caused this problem time way back in the past.
I mean, surely it would be appropriate for them to come up with a, quote, solution. If they were going to actually try to make solutions here, surely it would be appropriate for them to come up with a solution that does not involve completely pretending that the thing that happened previously didn't happen and it wasn't them.
Well, first off, I don't think
they should have a different approach to the way that they treat Hispanics, knowing that it was Hispanics that didn't want them to do any of this in the first place, and they should have a different approach to Native Americans, given that Native Americans wanted none of anyone other than themselves to be there.
Well, hold on. You're jumping around just a little bit. First off, I don't hear very many complaints from the Native American population in general, because we sort of effectively pacified them through one means or another. And so, whatever the Native Americans are complaining about, I'll have to look into it more, because I'm not exactly familiar with it. But on to specifically sort of
We're complaining about the pipeline that Trump supported. I forgot the name of the pipeline.
Oh, the XL or the whatever.
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, before we continue, first of all, how do I sound right now? And how do I sound right now? I mean, is there any difference in quality?
I think the first one sounded a bit better, actually.
The first one might be? Why? What's the difference?
Oh, I was getting closer to the mic, but anyway.
Okay, no, yeah.
The second one, I was getting closer to the mic.
Okay, yeah, well, they can complain. Well, look, when it comes to problem with the different ethnicities, both imported and native, that we have to deal with, I understand that at some point a long time ago, there were certain white people who created these problems. I do not think, though, that, Ray, the strategy that you're somewhat kind of endorsing here is that of the liberal left, whereas you have to cast this broad blanket of blame over the whole of white America, and the whole of white America has to be held accountable and deal with it. And I don't know if you
also what they do to everyone else, though.
What do you mean?
Like, for example, holding the entirety of the African American community accountable for like whatever happens in Detroit or something, or Chicago, or holding like all Chinese people responsible for like, I don't know, like some weird stuff that happened in Shenzhen or something. Like, oh, a guy in Shenzhen copied my intellectual property, therefore, like, all Chinese people are now in on the game or something, right? So this blanket thing seems to be happening all over the place, except for when you say, okay, what about white Americans? Then suddenly everyone's like, well, how can I chop this and dice this into the most, the highest number of different groups?
Well, no, I don't think the situations are comparable. Because
the MS-13 thing, for example, yeah, I just saw Enver put that there, so I won't take credit for just thinking that up. He just wrote MS-13. So, for example, when Trump came out and said, "Oh, there's MS-13 and there's M14 and whatever else there is," M14. But anyway, no, some people will get that joke. But either which way, there's MS-13 and all of these things, and they are rapists apparently, and all of this stuff, right? I mean, that looks pretty blanketed to me.
Mm-hmm. Look, no, there are certain problems which are identifiable through statistical leveling. Like you want to know what the best predictor of crime is, you can look at the race of the person, and that's a marvelously accurate predictor of crime and whether or not they're going to commit it.
West of the United States, if you actually use the FBI statistics and measure crime in the southwest of the United States, then the highest crime producing group in the southwest of the United States is African Americans. well, that probably will not surprise you. And then below that is basically whites and Hispanics who are tied and equal, and then below that is East Asians, right?
Well, yeah, East
So then
Asians
how
are the
does
lowest
Trump
wherever you go.
so then how does Trump come to the conclusion that basically they are killers, quote unquote, they are rapists, quote unquote, when the crime rate is literally the exact same as his own population group?
Well, because I don't think it's just looking. Well, first off, because the drug problem is one that goes beyond the Southwest, and of course, you can look at the crime rate in other states and see that in general, like if you take the national average, the white it usually when you break down crime rates by race, you guys know this. It goes blacks, Hispanics, whites, Asians, or
Yeah, it
South
rises.
Asians.
Yes, the Hispanic crime rate on the FBI statistics rises if you include the northeast of the United States and not just isolating it to the southwest. Because, like, if you go into a Hispanic town in the southwest of the US, that is probably one of the safest places you can actually be. Like, for example, El Paso, Texas is one of the safest places in the US, right? But if you go into the northeast...
Where are you getting that from? Because I'm not so sure about that.
UN's review, which is actually a right-wing source, believe it or not, and he's parsing FBI statistics, and he was, I guess he was trying to find something horrible, but was unable to actually do so in the Southwest. However, if you include statistics from the Northeast, then suddenly it changes up slightly because it's more elevated in the Northeast. But I think the reason it's more elevated in the Northeast is because it's a different source of quote-unquote Hispanic migration in the Northeast than in the Southwest. In the Southwest, you've got the people who are, quote, jumping the border, quote unquote, who are supposed to be the really bad guys or whatever that these guys are constantly upset about. They're the ones that actually aren't doing the crazy things that people are referring to. Whereas in the Northeast, it's slightly more elevated. And I do not actually know the reason for that, but it's because it's one of those things where you could probably disambiguate the country of origin and you can probably get something out of that.
Yeah, that might be the case. I don't deny that. But at the same time, you have to acknowledge that
blanketing, and it's not a real blanket then, because if you can actually differentiate it depending on where they came from and where they're living in the US, then it means there's something different going on there. It's not just a blanket of Hispanics doing things.
Well, it has to be accounted for that the people who get to the Northeast don't just simply get there because, they took the boat from Puerto Rico or Cuba all the time. They too came through the border at some point. And they just made it to the Northeast. One of the reasons
Enver is pointing out is that the Southwest has established communities, whereas outside that there's less community and thus more alienation. So it could also be the further you get away from the Southwest, the more likely that bad things are going to happen.
See, I would. Sorry, Nero. What was that?
Nothing. You were just quoting Enver again, but yeah.
No. What I would say to that is that, yeah, sure, there's certain amounts of alienation that occur the farther away you get to your homeland, but at the same time, I would say that could be the case. But at the same time, I've lived in New York for a great amount of time, the suburbs surrounding it as well. Like there are very, very established Hispanic communities here. So I don't think it's just that there's a lack of communities. I think one of the things is that what I would attribute it to is the fact that when you look at the concentration of, where does focus on the drug war go to, or the focus for illegal immigration go to, it always goes to the Southwest. Like the Southwest is, the hotbed of all right, well, we're going to keep Hispanics under the closest watch possible because this is where they're coming in. And so, we got them here. So we're going to pay hyper attention to here. And I think there's something about that Hispanics are aware of. They know they're under the lens in this area of the country because they know this is where U.S. efforts are most intensely focused in order to try to not get them out of the country or to bust them for some other crime. And so being aware of this, I think, has made them less likely to screw up, at least publicly, and because they don't want to get sent back right there. And once they're sort of out of that, under that microscope in the area of the northeastern United States, they feel like they're more able to get away with stuff.
No, it wasn't New York, for example, in the Northeast, a place where Rudolph Giuliani was basically doing his I'm not sure what the term for this thing is, but what was it? Stop and frisk, stop and check,
broken window,
something like this, broken window, all of this stuff. So, I mean, even by your own logic, I mean, if you go to New York City, you're under the sort of the all-seeing eye of the cop, right?
Well, no, it wasn't.
So well, the same thing applied there.
It's a different microscope there, though. Giuliani wasn't specifically targeting Hispanics in the same way ICE targets certain immigrants. Giuliani was targeting all criminals, and Hispanics just happened to fall into it.
What does this have to do with overpopulation? We've
Well, the point I was
topic.
Yeah, we have kind of gotten off topic
Yeah,
here.
the point I was getting to is in the arrangement of who lives where in North America. Because I was going to get there, just I forgot to actually add this part on. In the arrangement of who lives where in North America, if we consider North America to be one integrated economy, unless Trump makes it otherwise soon, right? Canada, the United States, and Mexico are essentially in the same economic basket because NAFTA exists. So if I take 100,000 people out of Mexico and I put them inside the United States, but then I don't fill Mexico back up, then all I've done really is I've actually just moved the people around. Technically, I haven't overpopulated anything if you just move people from one place to another within the same continent. So in other words, they're vacating one space to go to another space, but it's still within the same thing. So you don't actually have more people. You had people that moved.
Well, yeah, but you have overpopulation again. If you choose to view it from the global context, yeah, you don't have overpopulation on the global scale. Of course, there's overpopulation of certain areas that have more ecologically damaging effects for those specific areas that will eventually go on to have global ramifications.
Yes, that much I will give you. That it could be possible to have too many people in one specific city, for example, and then you created the effects of concentration, which are extremely bad. We saw this happen even within one country. You can have that happen. For example, South Korea had that problem through large parts of the initial part of its development after the 1960s, between 1960 and I guess 1989 or so. South Korea had that infamous problem. I think they referred to it as what were they calling it? There was some nickname they had for what they had created, which was truly disastrous. I think they were calling it the trash heap country or something, because of the fact that like large cities in South Korea were literally having piles of trash which was building up everywhere because people were concentrated too closely in the same areas and no one was actually taking out the trash. It became so bad that eventually the government, which was still a pseudo-dictatorship at that time anyway, implemented a policy which was designed to incentivize people to actually put the garbage and sort it into specific ways so that it could be recycled or whatever. And there was some weird system where if you don't do it, you have to pay some ridiculous fine, but if you do it, then they'll pay you a reward. And so then everyone cleaned it up and it became one of the cleanest countries in the world, which was kind of an interesting thing. And so there are some base level things which you can actually deal with in terms of incentives if you have people that have all clustered into one location and vacated the other spaces, because then it means you can develop in the other spaces they vacated and then essentially just have, I guess you could say, concentrated surveillance, if you want to call it that, concentrated oversight in the place where everyone has chosen to gather. The metropolitan area, basically, because it does make people easier to watch if they've all swarmed into one location.
Yeah, sure. I can see that. I can agree with that. I will. Nero wants to get on to talking about tobacco a little bit and that did sound interesting. So I will oblige, but I will first address some of Enver's musings in the chat, which is that this is all the result of capitalist development, and literally the only solution to any of this is the Green Party's platform. Which I mean. Yeah, I'd have to look more into the Green Party specifically. I can't say I was a fan of Jill Stein or anyone in this.
Does the Green Party's platform still contain that line about the utilization of trade to what's the word for it? The utilization of trade to make sure that different populations are able to get work in the location that they're in, thus resulting in not so much concentration? Is that still in their part? Is that still in their platform?
You're asking the wrong person. I don't give a crap about the Green Party.
Last time I checked their platform.
Last time I checked the platform was in 2012, so I don't know if they've removed it.
But, well, I mean, one of the things I would say is that a fun fact of the day, kids, Hitler started out in the Green Party because he, too, was an eco-conservationist, but...
He was also a vegan.
He was. I mean, look at that. Vegans, you're literally Hitler, but... No, in all seriousness, no. I will give him one thing, which is this idea that this is all the result of capitalist development. Yeah, I'm not going to disagree with that.
I mean, as you mentioned earlier about agricultural production, or what I mentioned about supply and demand, because there is a profit incentive to destroy, like, even not just agriculture. But here's the reason why I'm pessimistic about switching to green energy without some form of policies that would be unpopular to the Americans as a whole, is because, again, like the reason why CO2 is being used, why CO2 products are being used, is because it's cost effective. There is a profit incentive to engage in business practices that destroy the environment.
Yep.
So because of that, yeah, I mean, Enver does have a point. There is a profit incentive for big business to pollute the atmosphere.
But what if you
Because
just accelerated? What if you just accelerated these processes so they're completed as quickly as possible? Because we all know what the end result of the present phase of development we're in is, right? More proliferation of nuclear power, of course, more proliferation of oh goodness, natural gas, and ultimately, greater proliferation of hydrogen power and hybrid cars and things like this. And the faster we gallivant along this, the quicker we move away from fossil fuels, right? So why not just accelerate? Why not just accelerate toward it?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if we can accelerate, but just because you're speeding up the process of getting to that cleaner stage doesn't mean you're skipping over all the damage you do from like the carbon and other gases and other chemicals you've released in the process.
Yeah.
It just means you've gone through it quicker, and I don't know if we're able to survive that.
Indeed, but you're going to have to do it that way because, I mean, think about it this way. This is one of those things where it's going to sound weird when I say it this way, but if you take longer to do it, then it still means you've inflicted the exact same amount of damage. It's just that you've taken longer while doing it and thus introduced the opportunity for more things to go wrong. And what I mean by that is when you take too long in doing a developmental process, it gives more people opportunities to come in and disrupt what you were doing in the first place, and it also gives the opportunity of people to stall and delay implementing the things that ought to be implemented for when the actual time for running out comes.
Well, I could say
because you don't want to reach the end of the line and then find that you haven't actually got the things in place to do what needs to be done, because then you have a real crisis on your hand as opposed to just one that we are imagining.
No, of course, I understand what you're saying, but at the same time, I think it would take us some time to actually develop that. So while at the same time, if you extend the process, you do leave room for mistakes, of course, but you also leave enough room to develop a plan once you get to the final stages as well. So it's sort of it's a double-edged sword, kind of.
Yeah, but I mean, people are putting already. I mean, think of it this way: if we engaged in policy preferences that would result in gradual rising of wages, and we also engaged in non-stop free trade and reducing of tariff barriers in all cases we can possibly find it, that would in fact accelerate the rate at which we develop productive forces, right? I mean, everyone probably agrees that that's the case. But you just remove the barriers and let the people do what they're going to do. Right?
Yeah, again.
When they do that, we're going to get there really fast, and then we'll be able to actually solve the rest of the problems afterwards. This is why we get kind of impatient about this kind of protectionist stuff going on in the meanwhile, and all these cultural wars and things like this. You know, it'd be nice if we could just press the fast forward button on all of that. And just not do it.
I get that. But wait, I need to say something.
Go on, Nero, go on.
Yeah, I mean, as I've told you on the DM chat, unless you guys talk about another thing, like if you guys discussed homosexuality, because me and Ray both see promoting gay rights as a way to lower fertility rates, but you completely disagree. So unless you're willing to discuss something like that, I really have nothing else to say.
Well, I mean, I didn't.
We'll get to the tobacco. We'll get to the tobacco.
I was going to discuss tobacco and then hop off.
No, we can do that as well, but I just want to quickly get in on the thing about homosexuality. I don't think that I actually said that I thought homosexuality reduces birth rates.
But I think I don't think you would disagree.
I mean, well, it's one of those things where people who don't want to have sex with the opposite sex and thus will not be having children, we're not going to do it anyway, right? So it's one of those things where I don't think you'd promote it to cause a specific thing to happen, because as we all know,
No, that's
people who have homosexual inclinations have these inclinations regardless of whether we promote it or not.
No, because as a Catholic bugger Milo Yiannopoulos once said, if you put gay, like he mentioned how before the gay rights movement came to be, gays and lesbians would go into the closet by marrying people of the opposite sex and having children with them. That's his argument. So yeah, promoting gay rights does lower fertility rates, because if you force these people in the closet, the only way they can hide their sexuality in the long term is by getting married and having kids. And that's exactly what happened until the 1970s, when gay rights became a key issue in American domestic politics. And I think even Pragmatic would agree with that forcing gays into the closet would.
But I do agree with you that supporting gay rights is obviously a good idea. Like, absolutely fantastic, right? I do agree with you. Supporting gay rights is a good idea. It's just that I don't think that you would support it specifically for the purpose of driving down birth rates.
I know, but it's an argument in favor of that. Kind of like, I would use that as an argument for it. But yeah, I mean, I would argue there's evolutionary reasons why it should be accepted.
No, I
would agree.
Yeah. I just want to, before we move on to tobacco, Enver pulled up the Green Party platform line, which is a little bit vague. I'll just interpret it briefly, and then we can get on to tobacco. But it says, provide green jobs by enacting the full employment program, which will directly... hold on. That's a little bit further down than I wanted. Okay. Green support strong local economies and regional trade. The best mode of economic security is for a community and region to be largely self-sufficient in the production of its necessities. Provide green jobs by enacting full employment program, which will directly provide 16 million jobs in sustainable energy and energy efficient retrofitting, mass transit, and complete streets. I have an idea what that is, but I don't actually know. That promotes safe bike and pedestrian traffic, regional food systems based on sustainable organic agriculture, and clean manufacturing. So as Enver says, they are hippies, but there's something to the Green New Deal. I mean, I don't know. I don't know about the whole trying to force cities to go green via
sounds like jobs of the
subsidization.
future, right?
Yeah, kind of. Also, it doesn't.
Yeah, because I mean, you've given people something to do, and it's actually productive. Maybe.
Yeah, and the whole regional the whole regional trade thing is a little bit vague because it doesn't actually lay out a clear preference for whether or not they're talking about regional trade as in like interstate trade and not international, so they would support tariffs, versus regional trade as in global regions, so they would support free trade. It's a little bit vague in that area. So we could speculate, but before we go, I know it could be. I want to get on to just tobacco right now, just because I know Nero wants to get into it, because Nero has a very long spiel on how if we bring back tobacco, not only are we increasing our IQ, but we're also killing boomers. So
I admit I was a little joking about the whole boomer thing, but no, the whole I'm not going to take credit for what I'm about to say, besides the neo-Malthusian argument I'm going to get into afterwards, but this argument comes straight from someone I disagree with a lot when it comes to politics, but he's an alt-right YouTube user named Davis Arini.
Serini.
Arini, yeah, I'm sorry, but he's that bald guy who dresses all in dark clothing and smokes cigarettes and drinks, I believe, whiskey in every single video. You can't miss him. Yeah, he made a video basically arguing against marijuana. He argued that marijuana shouldn't, like every other drug out there, is better than marijuana. What it comes down to is he basically argued that marijuana turns people into lazy leftists who are desensitized to the world around them. Now, whether or not that's true is irrelevant, because what I'm getting into is he argued for bringing back tobacco, and he acknowledged that tobacco is a really bad plant because they use really hazardous chemicals to dry the leaves, and it's just a really bad plant. It's greedy and it takes time off your life, which I'll get into later. But what he did argue is very interesting, and he cites an article for this, and I'll give that to you, both that article and the video in question, in a second. But what he basically argued was that, is it really a coincidence that when cigarettes became popular, that's the most practical form of tobacco usage, is it really a coincidence that became popular right around the time the Industrial Revolution kicked off? And he also argued that not only that tobacco itself, its usage increases your IQ by 3 points, but highly intelligent people are the ones who used to smoke the most. especially the engineers. Like, engineers are people who are in highly mathematically oriented positions during the Industrial Revolution. They were chain smokers because nicotine stimulates stress genes, right? So and stress has been shown to have a negative effect on your productivity. So when you have these engineers and these really innovative thinkers doing their jobs in a way where stress is negligible, their productivity rises, and therefore everyone benefits. But ever since anti-smoking became the norm, starting in the 1960s, everyone stopped smoking, and now these people who are working in highly stressful STEM jobs, they are least productive now than they would have been, say, 100 years ago, because they stopped smoking the very thing that led them to become more productive. And not only that, but even in the modern context, there are two, as Ray argued before the stream, Asian societies, especially places like South Korea, they are smoking cigarettes a shit ton. And that might correlate with what Davis Arini argued about how people were more intelligent when they began smoking. Now,
yep, but we've already messed up part 2 of your plan, though, which is to limit the lifespan of people because of the fact that electronic cigarettes have been invented, and they were invented in Asia specifically to address. They were invented specifically to address that problem in Asia, and then expand.
Yeah, but the thing is that the first reason why I think that's a valid argument, bringing back tobacco, is because, yes, it does raise your IQ and it stimulates stress genes. And society was better off. It was much more intelligent, and it was a lot more. And the people who really created society as we know it today, the engineers especially, they were the ones who smoked the most. But now they don't. And I do think that they would be more productive if they smoked some more. But you know what? I've been going on a tangent, but here's my second argument for bringing back tobacco. It would expand the death rate. And that's where I get into the neo-Malthusian argument for tobacco. And that is, it's obvious. Smoking kills. It really does. But here's the difference between smoking and other forms of I wouldn't call dying from alcohol poisoning or smoking a suicide. I'm not sure if you would, Pragmatic, but I wouldn't. Or at least in a cultural context, we wouldn't see someone dying because they drink too much booze in the same light as someone pulling pointing a gun to their head and pulling the trigger, right?
I mean, it depends. Like, if you have the intent, like accidentally drinking yourself to death is one thing, but you can purposely drink yourself to death, which I would consider a suicide.
Yeah, that's a fair point. But my argument is essentially this, and this is irrefutable. When you promote tobacco, you're going to have higher death rates. You're going to have more and more people die early on because of the fact that they are smoking. So, and I would argue from a neo-Malthusian standpoint that that's a good thing, because it's not only a voluntary way to expand the death rate, but it also is, as Davis Arini argued, beneficial to society, because again, it raises IQ and it leads to higher productivity among people in mathematically oriented professions, such as especially the STEM fields. Now, Ray did bring up vaping. Unlike cigarettes, vaping is safe, at least as far as I know. It's probably not 100% safe. It's probably not 100% good for you. It's probably not
nearly. It's very stringently regulated, though, because there's something called TPD, which is the EU Tobacco Products Directive, which was established in November 2016. All e-cigarettes need to follow the TPD laws and regulations, and the Directive 2014-14 EU introduced new rules for nicotine-containing e-cigarettes and refill containers in Article 20, which ensure minimum standards for the safety and quality of all vape products. Anyone who manufactures or imports these products, or who rebrands any other product as their own, must submit information about their products through the European Common Entry Gate notification portal. Yeah. And then they investigate all of your stuff, and they find find out whether it's actually okay or not. And so what you've got going on there is basically the safest vaping environment which can be imagined on the face of this earth.
Okay, but before Pragmatic gets into responding to the Davis-Arini argument and the Malthusian argument that it expands death rates, tobacco does. I do apologize for stuttering a lot. My public speaking skills are, I will be honest, my public speaking skills are perfected when I have notes. And I did have a lot of notes for this stream. I did not prepare anything for the tobacco discussion. I really wish I did, but yeah,
no problem. Look, don't worry about it, man. No, I guess
I'm using literally 0 notes right now.
Yeah, no, I don't think. I guess to respond, I don't really have necessarily a response because I can't say in particular. There's nothing here I inherently impose. Like, if people want to, cut their life shorter by smoking cigarettes, then, they can do that. I think if people, to promote it, I don't think is, there's a lot of other vices out there that are far worse to promote than smoking. And, if it comes with all these positive correlations, I mean, I'm not saying it's a good thing to promote, but I'm also not saying it's necessarily the worst thing. Because at the end of the day, there can be cultural pressure. And of course, I'm not like this, psychological individualist where it's like, you're the author of all your actions and all your own thoughts, yada, yada, yada. Of course, you can be pressured into things or, there's some societal leaning on you. But I don't think, of all the things that are being promoted by society and at large right now, if we were to return to just promoting smoking or even promoting it over something else, like I think, getting smoking is might end your life a little bit faster than alcoholism.
I still think it'd be a bad idea though, because bringing back smoking after we got to a point where vaping is now a thing, all that would happen in my expectation is that people would not just die immediately anyway, according to Nero's plan. Instead, what they do is they die very, very, very slowly, and the NHS would try to keep them alive throughout that entire thing, and thus the economy would be hemorrhaging money to pay for the lung problems of people who shouldn't actually have lung problems because they should have been vaping instead.
Yeah, but then you don't. But then you can just get into the whole argument that you shouldn't treat certain conditions that are self-inflicted. The NHS should not.
Yeah, but then no, but I mean that's politically untenable. Like, is anyone going to get on television seriously as a party leaders debate and be like, "We've got this new plan"?
I don't know. The Tories in your country are open about cutting benefits for people who are disabled. So yeah, I think
they were not. No, they were not open about that. That was actually that was.
But they do it in a way that's open. Everyone knows
that was a scandal because of the fact that they created these weird systems that ended up with them creating that scenario, but they didn't set out explicitly. Or they didn't come out and say on campaign on that, like, hey guys, we got this idea. Like, you would like the thing that you're talking about would be such an explicit, specific policy that they wouldn't be able to accidentally do that and pretend that they didn't know how it happened.
Well, I
think it would be very politically difficult for anyone to pull that one off.
Well, even if the Tories don't necessarily campaign on it over there, certainly Republicans in the United States do to some extent. They certainly. I mean, you got people like Rand Paul who openly campaign about ending programs like Social Security or Medicaid or Medicare and things like that. And I mean, the Liberty Caucus makes a pretty big point out of that as well. I mean, they don't make the biggest stink about it, and they kind of do it as a talking point because they know they'll never get it. So, I'd like to see what happens if push actually came to shove and they could actually get a vote on the Senate or the House floor to end Medicaid properly. But there are, to Nero's point, there are people who certainly campaign on ending this thing. And it's not necessarily, I mean, maybe it's politically impossible in Europe, but certainly not in the United States and maybe not Canada.
Yeah.
How it points out again,
though, is that even with universal health care, like if I were, say, someone who is depressed, and my way of coping with that is cutting myself. And if I cut myself to the point where I accidentally cut a vein that is vital to my life, and it's my fault, I was the one who cut myself in that way, knowing full well the consequence of that. If I were a British citizen, should the British taxpayer focus all their energy on treating me for a stupid decision I made? No. There needs to be personal responsibility taken into account. that's just my take on it. Personal responsibility should be taken into account if you have a universal healthcare system, which I fully agree with. I do think universal healthcare is a good option. I just think the way it would be implemented in the US would be like how Medicaid is handled, where
holy shit
would set the stuff.
Oops, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. But it'd be like, I don't know how, like the closest thing to that was Medicare for all, but Hillary Clinton's criticisms of Bernie Sanders' Medicare for all plan was valid. You can't really rush stuff like that out. But yeah, that's my only counter argument to that.
Well, I don't think
on the commons. Yeah, they would. Yeah, but you don't contribute the commons to people who engage in self-harm and knowingly engage in self-harm. That's all I can really say.
well, one other thing, not to necessarily disagree with that point, but more so on the idea of a Medicaid for all or an NHS style system coming to the US. I don't think that's quite possible here. Because again, to refer to like an alt-type video and the stats he brings up, the reason it's been able to last as long as it has in Europe is because, if we're basing it off of, say, like whites as taxpayers in the United States, whites have constantly had a surplus in terms of what they've done in tax. Like they've always what am I trying to say here? I know what I'm trying to say. Yes, whites have been net tax contributors, whereas other races haven't been. And leaning on that fact in Europe, which is a majority white country, they've been able to fund these systems for a very long time. Whereas in the US, it's speculated that Medicaid is probably going to be defunded by 2025 or something like that. I forget the report. It came out like a couple weeks ago now. But so I think, while I don't necessarily disagree with the idea in principle anymore, there are certainly sustainability questions, as even in Europe, there have been, countries that have been able to sustain it for quite some time. It is slowly sort of starting to unravel there as well. So all these things have to be taken into account as we consider this. But I'm definitely with Nero that people who are, sort of engaging in self-destructive behaviors, even if they are, unless it's something genuinely major, like they shouldn't be. Well, I don't know. Actually, I don't know if I agree with Nero, because I'm thinking about it. It's like, if they're contributing to the commons and they harm themselves, it's shitty, but they should be able to take it back out what they put into the commons. Like, especially if it's like they're mentally unstable beyond their own control. Like, I'm late. I'm tired. I'm going back and forth on this. I need to hear Ray and you discuss this a little bit more, and then I'll make up my mind.
Well, the only thing I was going to do is I was going to go back to the original refrain I was saying in the first place, is that all of these measures of basically trying to find weird ways to make people die, which is basically what this is, right? I mean, all these measures to try to make people die in weird ways is based on the initial and original problem, which is that the birth rate in the scenario we're describing is wrong because people keep preventing women from making the choices that they're supposed to be able to make. So, like, again, this is one of those things where you don't need to do all of this if you just have the
but Ray, I completely agree with you on
stuff in the first place.
Ray, I completely agree with you on the use of preventative measures that cut back on population size. But the reason why I favor positive checks on population size is simply to accelerate the depopulation process. It's not because I am like pragmatic. I'm not someone who thinks woman's first duty is to be a caretaking mother at a home. No, I don't believe that. I don't believe that at all. However, I do believe that positive checks accelerate the depopulation process. And by the way, I wish I didn't just use the word depopulation, because that has a really negative connotation to it. But what I'm trying to say is lowering the population size. But that's literally the definition of depopulation. So if people are going to think I'm advocating for what Thanos did, go fuck yourself. But yeah.
I mean, I'm willing to kind of just leave it there for now. Anybody else got any final comments?
Yeah, not really.
Nope.
Besides,
next time around we should finally do the summary of all the things that have happened in relation to the Russia investigation next time. Because I was wondering if this time was going to be that, but this time was not that.
Yes, because you had that list from.
I had that list, and it has since then grown because so many things have happened. It's almost like every single day there's a new thing that has happened, and it's connected to this issue. So it's truly amazing.
I am disappointed, however, that we didn't get much into Africa, because that is really where the material manifestations of overpopulation have been demonstrated in a way that's unfathomable.
That's true, and we didn't get too much into Malthus himself either, because I didn't hear. We didn't let Denying History and you go at it, Nero, too much. So.
Yeah, but maybe next time we can get into Malthus in Africa a bit, and then just end it there, and then we don't have to discuss overpopulation for a long time.
And we'll get into Trump. Maybe we'll start it with Malthus and Africa, and then we'll end on the whole expository thing on Trump.
No, I do think besides the one with NatSec, where NatSec muted people for bullshit reasons, I think this will probably be your most controversial stream. So
only there's one dislike already, so. We'll see if it grows. I think that's from what's his name or what's her name? I have no clue. I think that's from who was it? I think it's from that Sutalfa person. I don't know, because I think I said something in direct response to them, and then I noticed the dislikes. But maybe that's just me.
Yeah, but this is probably going to be your most controversial stream, because not just what me and Ray said, but again, because you basically argued that
negative eugenics,
that the war on drugs is a good way I apologize
to check the population. No, I get what you're saying.
Yeah, and then also that the war on drugs can also be used as a form of negative eugenics, where people who have high birth rates and low IQs on average are put into environments where they're completely unable to reproduce. Like, that's a statement that's not only going to piss off your libertarian fans, but you're also going to piss off a bunch of leftists who think that prison is evil, which I agree a prison system is kind of fucked up. And I also oppose the death penalty. You are more like the Reddy, but I actually think the death penalty is completely stupid. But we can discuss that another day, maybe.
Yeah, I think that in relation to this stream, I think I'm relatively safe coming out the other end of it, because I think almost all of the suggestions in the stream were too extreme for me. So I was just like,
that's a first.
Yeah, no to all. So it's going to be one of those things where I don't think I'll be able to get in trouble for any of these. Hopefully I won't get in trouble for any of these. But I'm sure that what's going to actually happen is before we're going to have classical liberals listen to the stream, realize I'm not doing any of this stuff, and then attribute it to me anyway and blame me, because that's usually what happens.
Exactly. And plus, Academic will probably whine about us on Twitter tomorrow, because that's what we did last time. Like, literally.
Yeah. I will be blamed, of course, for something. I just don't know what it's going to be yet, but there's going to be something.
I predicted.
To address the tweets he made about me, he said you were slumming it here, which hurt my feelings deeply. I don't know. I don't know if Academic is listening right now, because he did subscribe to this channel. I did get a little notification a day or two ago saying that Academic had subscribed to me, which I'm grateful for. But sir, if you are listening, you said Ray was slumming it here. I resent that comment. My channel is not a slum. I am not some Bangladeshi suburb or whatever. My channel is pristine, and I would like an apology from you. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Oh, and by the way,
you have to say it the way that he would say it, the way that he's been saying it to other people all week. Whenever people say things he doesn't like, you have to be like, what was it? I do not accept this comment. Retract immediately.
By the way, I just have one comment to finish us off that I find funny. Well, it's sort of funny to me, but you probably won't get it. But me and Denine have spent a little bit of our free times looking at this really shitty-ass 6-hour documentary from this neo-Nazi named Dennis Wise called The Greatest Story Never Told. I'm not sure if Ray or Pragmatic have heard of it, but me and Denine certainly have. But imagine if there was a parody of that documentary called Thanos, The Greatest Story Never Told, and completely defended Thanos, because Thanos did nothing wrong, guys. He was completely correct.
Was it Denying History? Was that you who typed that in the chat, or was that you, Nero?
It was me who said Thanos. That Thanos didn't was correct. Wait, what are you referring to? You mean the comment about Thanos, the greatest story never told?
Yeah, I thought I saw that fly by in the chat a little earlier.
Yeah, that was me. That was me.
Okay.
Have you heard of that documentary, by the way?
No, I haven't, but I'm interested in it now.
It's really bad. I mean, Denying. I don't know if Denying's still on, but he can recommend you a book that completely debunks it. But it's still an amusing concept, a documentary that's similar, but defends Thanos.
Nice.
That's just a funny concept.
All right, so that's where we'll end it for now, ladies and gentlemen. Thanos did nothing wrong. Malthus was kind of right, and shit. What else? What else did we go over?
And stop killing vagabonds.
Maybe we'll put a pin in that one. But until next time, thank you all for listening. Thank you everybody for being here with me, my fellow panelists, I guess. And we'll see you all next time. Goodbye.